Hey guys, tonight we're diving nose first into a world so pungent, so offensively fragrant, that your modern sinuses would probably file a lawsuit. That's right, tonight we're plunging deep into why the medieval stench wasn't just bad, it was history's worst. The kind of smell that could peel paint off a monastery wall and make even a plague doctor reach for an extra sachet of herbs. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. Not because there's a joust gone wrong, or a mysterious poison in your goblet of mead, though, let's be honest, both are possible, but because your nose will tap out long before you do. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not trying to smell bomb your night without consent. And hey, I'm curious. What city are you watching from and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I want to know if you're listening to tales of medieval sewage at 3 AM from a candlelit bathtub. Respect. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive in a bustling medieval city, let's say London, though it could be Paris, Bruges, or Florence. Really, the stench was impressively international. As you step through the city gates, your senses are ambushed. It's not one smell, it's an orchestra. A fermented symphony of rotting vegetables, manure, sweat, spoiled fish, unwashed bodies, smoke and urine. Always urine. It pools in the cobbled streets and steams in the summer heat, an olfactory assault that might make your eyes water before you've even reached the market square. You're not imagining it. This isn't some overblown myth or the result of Hollywood makeup. Life in the Middle Ages really did smell that bad. For starters, people rarely bathed. Once a month if you were lucky, maybe twice a year if you were holy. You're already clenching your nostrils, aren't you? But here's the kicker. No one thought they smelled. Not really. This was just life. Imagine being born into a world where every person around you smells like they've been working a farm, sleeping in their clothes, and using the nearest bush as a bathroom for weeks, because they probably have. Now pause and take a breath. Wait. Maybe don't. You glance to your right, and there's a merchant hacking up phlegm into the gutter beside a baker's stall. The baker, by the way, has his sleeves rolled up, kneading dough with hands he hasn't washed since... ever? He's surrounded by flies so dense they look like a living cloud. The bread smells amazing, but that's just because your nose is desperate for anything that doesn't reek of human waste and old fish. But here's what we do know. Medieval cities were designed without sanitation in mind. The layout, the proximity of animals, the total absence of clean water systems, it was a recipe for unrelenting stench. And no matter where you went, church, tavern, castle, you couldn't escape it. Even the royal court smelled like wet dog mixed with candle soot and human breath, filtered through 10 layers of linen. So yeah, welcome to the past. It's fascinating, it's brutal, and it smells like 1,000 years of no thanks. You're still in the city, but now you're beginning to understand that this isn't just a casual funk, it's a way of life. And the deeper question is this: why didn't people just bathe? Let's dig in, slowly and with a clothespin over your nose. Bathing in the medieval world wasn't as simple as turning a knob and waiting for the water to get hot. In fact, depending on your station and the time period, the idea of regularly immersing yourself in water ranged from exotic luxury to possibly evil. Yeah, evil. But we'll get to that. First, let's picture a typical bathing situation. You, a medieval peasant or even a well-to-do merchant, want to get clean. There's no indoor plumbing, so you haul water from a communal well or stream. You heat it over a fire, then you pour it into a wooden tub you had to borrow, share or scrounge. Bathing becomes a half-day event, and if you're doing this in winter, forget it. Unless you enjoy turning into a historical popsicle. Now, in the earlier Middle Ages, say around the 9th to 11th centuries, public bathhouses were actually quite common, especially in Islamic cities and parts of southern Europe. Even in cities like Paris and London, bathhouses popped up in the 12th and 13th centuries. These weren't spa-day luxury experiences either. They were sweaty, steamy and very communal. Whole families bathed together, or at least in shifts. Water was reused, towels were optional, and the rules on clothing? Let's just say modesty was pretty flexible, then it gets weird. As we roll into the 14th and 15th centuries, the narrative shifts. Suddenly bathing is under suspicion. The Black Death hits Europe, and people start pointing fingers. Bad air, bad water, Naked bodies together in steamy rooms? Sounds sinful, right? Bathhouses start getting accused of being fronts for brothels. Moral reformers and clergy start denouncing them. The idea spreads that opening your skin's pores with warm water actually lets disease inside, so people close their pores with dirt, not a metaphor, literally. It becomes common for people to believe that not bathing is a safer, even holier way to live. Here's where it really locks in. By the late Middle Ages, many believed that changing your shirt often was basically the same as bathing. Yes, just changing your underlayer. You'd go months without washing your body, but if you switched tunics once a week, you were clean enough. And then there were the gloves. Oh, the gloves. Perfumed gloves became a must-have accessory for the wealthy, often soaked in ambergris, a waxy, sweet-smelling substance produced in the intestines of sperm whales. Don't ask. Or rosewater, and used to politely hold back the urge to gag when someone less fragrantly armoured approached. Even letters between nobles sometimes mentioned the delightful odour of your glove, which really says a lot about their priorities. But let's not get it twisted. The nobility weren't clean, they just stank better. Their linens were slightly fresher, their chamber pots were emptied more often, by servants, and their access to herbs and oils meant their body odour came with a side of sandalwood. And still, beneath it all, they reeked. Sweat-soaked undergarments, unwashed scalps, and the scent of meat-heavy diets all combined to create a bouquet that no amount of myrrh could erase. You glance around and notice a couple of young squires chasing each other in a game that's equal parts horseplay and informal sparring. They're laughing, sweating, and wearing at least 3 layers of clothing each. Their shirts, worn close to the skin, haven't seen a wash since spring, and it's now late summer. Every movement releases a puff of odour so ripe you can almost hear it. And yet, this wasn't seen as a problem. In fact, smelling like a hard-working man, or a noble who spent his day hawking or hunting, was sometimes seen as masculine. Virility had a scent, apparently, and it wasn't sandalwood. For women, it was a bit trickier. They were supposed to be dainty and fragrant without being too openly perfumed, because too much scent was considered flirtatious. Maybe even scandalous. It was a delicate balance of body odour and social reputation, like a very bad-smelling game of chess. What's fascinating is how much attention went into constructing an illusion of cleanliness. This was a world where smelling rich could protect your reputation, but also where bathing too much might make people suspect you were vain, or worse, loose. People whispered about women who bathed too frequently, as if warm water and moral collapse were inextricably linked. And speaking of moral collapse, let's not forget the church. The church had a complicated relationship with hygiene. While some religious orders promoted periodic bathing, others leaned into the dirt. Saints were often described as smelling bad, as if physical decay was a sign of spiritual purity. Take Saint Lutgarde of Evière. Her stench was apparently so strong that people gave her a wide berth. But to her fellow nuns, that scent wasn't a flaw. It was proof of her holy suffering. You, meanwhile, are trying not to retch. Here's a juicy fringe fact. Some nobles wore scent-infused shirts made of rabbit fur or fine linen, which were so strongly perfumed they were said to sweeten the room. One Hungarian countess reportedly had her servants reapply perfume to her undergarments 3 times a day. But again, they were never washed. The perfume just layered on like lacquer on a mouldering wood chest. Welcome to the open-air petting zoo that was the Middle Ages, and petting isn't recommended. Let's start with pigs, because they were the unsung sanitation workers of the medieval world. People kept pigs not just for food, but because pigs ate everything. Table scraps, bones, spoiled vegetables, even human waste. If you squint, they were sort of an early garbage disposal system. A squealing, unpredictable, occasionally aggressive disposal system. But they did their job, cleaning up what the street rakers missed, except they weren't exactly trained. Pigs roamed freely through most towns and cities, rooting in alleys, charging through marketplaces, and sometimes biting the occasional unfortunate child. City laws tried to keep them under control. In 1372, Paris declared that pigs couldn't wander the streets unaccompanied. Did people listen? Absolutely not, because who has time to leash walk their garbage pig when you've got grain to thresh and plagues to avoid? Horses were everywhere too. Every cart, every delivery, every noble on parade was pulled by or mounted on a horse. That meant the streets were constantly being splattered with manure. There were no horse diapers, no clean-up crews beyond the rare and overwhelmed raker, and certainly no traffic enforcement. In fact, entire areas of some cities were known by the amount of horse waste they accumulated. Picture living in a place casually referred to as Dunghill Lane. And yes, that was a real address. And dogs don't even start. Packs of semi-feral mutts roamed the streets, scavenging and fighting and occasionally digging through corpses during particularly rough winters. They weren't pets, not really. Some people fed them, others threw rocks. But their droppings joined the daily stew on the streets, contributing to a kind of ever-present smear on the city's olfactory reputation. But the real treat, the pièce de résistance of medieval street life, was the open-air market, and not the fancy canvas-canopied farmers' markets you're imagining. These were muddy, chaotic, unregulated sprawl zones packed with yelling vendors, leaking carts and fish that had clearly passed the point of no return. You walk into one now, and your senses get ambushed. There's a butcher's stall with slabs of meat hanging in the open air, slick with flies. Blood pools on the ground, mixing with mud and dung into a paste that smells like regret. A fish seller is arguing with a customer, slapping a flaccid eel on the table like a challenge. Next door, someone is trying to sell fresh eggs, though half the shells are cracked and the rest are covered in feathers and, well, nature. You breathe through your mouth, but that doesn't help. It just brings the taste into it. There's something iron-like in the air, maybe from the butchery, or maybe that's just your imagination recoiling. Now keep in mind, this market is normal. This is where people came to shop every day. There were no refrigeration units, no trash collection, no plastic wrap. You bought your meat, and if, the moment you leave the market behind, you think, naively, that the worst might be over, you've dodged the pig parade, sidestepped unspeakable puddles, and managed to not faint at the butcher's stall. But then you reach the river. Ah, the river. In a modern world, rivers are symbols of tranquility, of natural beauty, of that one guy fly fishing for serenity. In medieval Europe, the river is where your soul goes to cry. Take the Thames in London, or the Seine in Paris, or pretty much any body of water flowing past a medieval city. If you think rushing stream implies freshness, prepare to be emotionally betrayed. Because these rivers didn't just carry water, they carried everything: human waste, animal entrails, slaughterhouse runoff, brewery dregs, dead rats, sometimes dead people. You don't drink from it, you survive it. You reach the riverbank and immediately regret it. The stench hits like a wall. There's a tannery upstream. You know this because the water is tinged with a disturbing greyish-brown hue, and the air carries the distinct smell of rotting flesh mixed with urine. Tanning leather in the Middle Ages required soaking hides in a stew of lime, water, animal brains, and, you guessed it, urine. And not just a little, barrels of it, collected from public urinals, inns, even kindly neighbours. Need to tan a hide? Bring your own pee. Now imagine that stew draining straight into the river. Add to it the contents of every chamber pot dumped from tenement windows, the waste from every fishmonger's stall, and the runoff from every latrine that didn't have a proper cesspit. The water churns slowly, thick with debris and secrets. Occasionally a bloated animal carcass floats by, lazily spinning like it's in no rush to go anywhere. And here's the shocking part. People still used this water. They washed clothes in it. They rinsed produce in it. They even drank it, though, to be fair, this was usually after it had been diluted, boiled into ale, or blessed and crossed fingers by a hopeful priest. Water filtration was not really a thing yet. Sandpits and cloth strainers helped a little, but mostly you just hoped your immune system was doing its job, or you stuck with beer, which at 2 to 3% alcohol was safer than most water sources. Children drank it, monks brewed it, and your average medieval citizen trusted a cloudy pint more than a cup of clear water. You take a step closer to the water's edge, trying to imagine how anyone could tolerate this, let alone live near it. The houses along the river have shuttered windows and stained walls. Laundry hangs limply above the water, blowing in the breeze like surrender flags. A group of women kneels by the bank, scrubbing clothing with stones and harsh soap, chatting casually as if they're not kneeling in what is essentially God's neglected toilet. One of them pauses to yell at a boy wading too close to a floating sack. She shouts something about rats in the flour and he scurries back, but not before you see him splash through something that leaves a suspicious film behind. Lovely! And now, the wild twist. For all its filth, the river was also a place of beauty. Sort of. Painters and poets wrote about the shimmering waters, the life-giving stream. They didn't mention the floating bloated sheep carcass in the background, but hey, poetry is all about creative license. People picnicked near the river, lovers met there under moonlight, kids played along the banks. It was the town's lifeblood, and also its sewer. There's a haunting debate among historians about how aware medieval people really were of the river's toxicity. Some argue they knew full well that the water was contaminated and simply had no alternative. Others suggest they believed the current carried away the filth, leaving the water magically cleansed a few feet downstream. The dilution is the solution to pollution strategy, medieval edition. And there were moments, crises really, when the river's filth became undeniable. Let's fast forward a few centuries for a moment to highlight a particularly pungent example. The Great Stink of 1858. Yeah, it's technically not medieval, but it's the grandchild of centuries of medieval sewage habits. That summer, London's Thames reached such an unbearable level of putridity that Parliament had to hang soaked curtains in vinegar just to keep working. The smell was so overwhelming that officials finally started taking modern sanitation seriously. But you know what they blamed it on? The smell, not the bacteria. Miasma theory was still holding court like a stubborn monarch. So you might ask, if they didn't know about germs, why did they care about smell at all? Because to the medieval mind, bad smells weren't just unpleasant, they were dangerous. The miasma theory held that disease travelled through bad air, and foul smells were considered physical evidence of moral or spiritual decay. A foul-smelling place wasn't just unhygienic, it was unholy. That's why incense was used in churches, why herbs were hung in windows, and why physicians carried sweet-smelling pomanders when tending to the sick. They were fighting off sin with scent. You watch now as a boat struggles upstream, its single rower wiping sweat from his brow as he rows through sludge. The oars make sickening squelches every time they dip below the surface. His cargo? Barrels. Probably ale. You hope they're sealed. He looks tired, resigned, like a man who's accepted the river for what it is, a monster that lets you live so long as you don't ask too many questions. Nearby, a fish vendor dips a net into the river and pulls up a few gasping perch. You lock eyes with one. It does not look healthy. Someone nearby cheers. Dinner. You back away. Here's another delightfully disturbing fringe fact. In some cities, public baths were built right over rivers or streams. Water flowed underneath, allegedly carrying away the waste as people bathed above. It was like having your own river-powered plumbing system, except, instead of, you move deeper into the city. Underfoot, the ground squelches. Why? Because there's no organised sewage system. At best, a shallow channel runs down the middle of the street, theoretically meant to carry away the mess, but it's clogged, constantly, with things that should never see daylight, discarded animal parts, greasy food scraps, and once in a while, something deeply unsettling that may or may not be human. There's a man with a wheelbarrow full of dung. You think, oh, he's cleaning up, and for a fleeting second you feel hope. But no. He's a dung collector, sure, but he's not disposing of it. He's selling it, to farmers, to herbalists, to people who use it as fuel. The smell clings to him like a second skin, and when he passes by, it's like walking through a wall of hot breath from a dragon who's been eating garbage. You find yourself near the fishmonger. Bold move. The fish on the stall isn't exactly fresh. Most of it was caught days ago, maybe salted a bit, but it's definitely auditioning for a new career in necromancy. The smell could knock over a grown ox. And the flies here? They're partying like it's the feast of St. Swithin. You notice some patrons wrinkle their noses, but no one complains. This is dinner, after all. You eat what you get. Fun fact, your own clothes aren't helping. You're wearing wool, probably layered, and definitely not machine washable. In fact, it hasn't been properly washed in weeks, maybe months. Lye soap is rare and expensive, and when it is used, it's strong enough to burn your skin. So you go without, and your tunic gets that special kind of funk that only humans and livestock can generate. And if you're lucky enough to be staying at an inn, don't expect better air quality. Picture a room shared with 10 strangers, none of whom have bathed, all breathing heavily in the dark. There's a straw mattress that's seen more fleas than a rat convention. The chamber pot is under the bed. overflowing, and yeah, you're sleeping next to it. Let's just say Fabrizi is centuries away. Here's the quirky part. Some people believe that bad smells were good for you. That's right. Miasma theory, the big medical idea of the time, said disease spread through bad air. So paradoxically, some folks believed that their stinky environments actually hardened them. Meanwhile, scholars argued that pleasant smells could weaken the spirit or even make you vulnerable to sin. Imagine someone today saying, "This is my disease prevention strategy," while waving around a compost pile. And this is where historians love to argue. Some insist medieval people were oblivious to their own odour, while others argue they were deeply aware and used perfumes, herbs, and even rituals to combat it. Still others claim smell was so normalised, people simply developed a kind of olfactory amnesia. Like when you live with cats and stop noticing the litter box, you've adapted. But did medieval people, or were they just constantly gagging internally and pretending it was fine? We may never know for sure. So here's the scholarly debate of the night. Was the medieval aversion to bathing driven more by fear of disease or by religious and moral conservatism? Some argue the church discouraged bathing out of modesty. Others say the post-plague paranoia over miasma made people retreat from water. And still others think it was just logistical. Bathing was a pain. Why bother when everyone stinks equally? You're beginning to acclimate now, not to the smell because that's impossible, but to the logic. This world doesn't operate like yours, and as you look around, you notice a pair of finely dressed noblemen walking by, dabbing their wrists with perfume-soaked handkerchiefs, chatting about court politics. They smell like dried roses and rank sweat. A weird combo, but better than nothing. For now, you clutch your own herbs tighter, resist the urge to breathe deeply, and keep walking. The further you wander, the more you realise that in medieval society, wealth didn't buy cleanliness. It just bought more creative ways to smell slightly less offensive. Now you're in the wealthier quarter of town, near the manor houses and the finer merchant homes, and the first thing you notice isn't silence or space, it's scent. Not good scent exactly, more like expensive camouflage. Here's the scene. A noblewoman steps out of a carriage, trailed by two servants, and what looks like a small weather system of perfume. She's not clean, not by your standards, but she smells floral, spicy, maybe a little soapy. She's powdered, perfumed, and dressed in layer after layer of velvet and brocade, each one trapping a bit more of her natural human musk. She's wearing what might be described as a walking sauna, and the idea is simple. If you can't be clean, you can at least smell rich. You quickly realise that everyone around here is doing the same thing. Wealthy men carry pomanders, tiny ornate balls filled with herbs, spices or dried flowers, on chains around their waists. They sniff them periodically like medieval Vicks inhalers. Ladies tuck scented sachets into their bodices. Even the wigs, stiff and towering and powdered into submission, are doused in lavender or civet musk. One knight you pass by has a cloak that smells like cloves and pine sap, which isn't bad until he moves, and the underlying wave of human odour hits like a surprise attack. Let's talk wigs for a second, because they're one of the weirder chapters in the war on stench. In medieval and early Renaissance periods, head lice were common, very common. So common, in fact, that people often shaved their heads and wore wigs to avoid infestation, because clearly swapping your real hair for someone else's was a sanitary upgrade. These wigs weren't washed. Instead, they were powdered with starch and perfumed to the point where they could survive a fire by sheer density alone. Some even had little perfume-infused pads sewn inside the base, like built-in air fresheners for your scalp. This led to an entire culture of smell masking, using herbs, vinegar, scented gloves and floral pomanders to overpower your own natural bouquet. It was the Axe body spray strategy 600 years early. But the rich, they had their own way of smelling clean. Nobles used what were called dry baths. Picture yourself naked in a room while a servant sprinkles you with rose petals, then pats you down with cloths dipped in alcohol or herbal infusions. You're still filthy under the surface, but now you reek of lavender gin. Congrats. Still, medieval people did understand that dirt could be removed with water, they just didn't apply that idea consistently. A fun and frustrating contradiction. Monks and nuns were required by rule to bathe several times a year, 4 to 6 times, sometimes more depending on the order. That's right. Cleanliness is next to godliness was actually on the books. But in practice, Most monastic washing happened at key festivals or before communion, and even then only the hands and feet were prioritised. Of course, the peasants, they had other things to worry about, like surviving. You're toiling in the fields all day, sweating in the sun, digging in the dirt, and then collapsing at night in a shared one-room cottage. Bathing isn't on your to-do list. At best, you splash some cold water on your face in the morning. Maybe rub your armpits with a mint leaf. Done. And when you did finally get that rare, precious bath, it was a big deal. Sometimes the whole family would take turns in the same tub, starting with Dad, of course, then Mum, then the kids from oldest to youngest. By the time baby got in, the water was mostly brown soup. That old phrase, "don't throw the baby out with the bath water," yeah, not a metaphor either. Here's a curious little detail. The medieval people loved their feet. Not in a weird way, okay, maybe a little weird, but in a hygienic way. Foot washing was a sign of humility, hospitality, and sometimes even eroticism. In many households, especially in noble ones, guests were offered warm water to wash their feet. You've got dirt caked up to your ankles, so it makes sense. Feet were like the medieval version of a handshake. Cleanish feet, good character. Crusty feet, something's off. Now, if you're thinking, well, maybe medieval women were cleaner. Not quite. Sure, women did a lot of laundry and housework, but their own bathing schedules weren't much different. In fact, during menstruation, or after childbirth, women were often actively discouraged from bathing. It was thought to weaken the body or invite spirits in through the open pores. Instead, you'd be wrapped in warm cloths and left to stew in your own juices. Lovely, isn't it? Of course, not everyone agreed with these ideas. Even back then, there were outliers. Scholars, travellers and doctors who championed bathing. People who insisted that washing helped the body, lifted the spirit and calmed the mind. Islamic cities like Cordoba and Baghdad had fully functioning bathhouses, advanced plumbing, and even written hygiene manuals. But the ripple effect across Christian Europe was slow, uneven, and often reversed by fear and superstition. And here comes the scholarly debate. Were these scented clothes and accessories a genuine effort at hygiene, or just social theatre? Some historians argue that medieval aristocrats believed they were clean, as long as they smelled like roses and spices. Others claim they knew full well they were masking rot, but appearances mattered more. Smell, after all, was tied to morality, class and status. If you stank like a labourer, you might be mistaken for one. If you stank like cinnamon and old silk, at least you stank like someone with property. You're starting to see how this whole society was built on layers. Layers of fabric, layers of scent, layers of denial. It wasn't just that bathing was rare, it's that the alternatives became art forms in their own right. People curated their scent profiles like medieval influencers. Today I'm going for bergamot over barnyard. Does this civet pouch clash with my doublet? It's absurd and impressive all at once. And despite all this effort, despite the pomanders and powders and scented gloves, the smell of decay always found a way in. The walls of even the finest homes were made of wood and wattle, prone to damp and mould. Rats scurried freely beneath floorboards. Candles and oil lamps filled the air with smoke. Add the occasional unwashed visitor, and suddenly that sweet blend of frankincense and mildew doesn't seem so luxurious. As the sun sets, you retreat from the noble quarter, nose twitching, eyes watering slightly. You pass a group of servants dumping chamber pots into a side alley, the contents splashing with an audible squelch. Behind them, a boy plays with a stick completely unfazed. To him, this is just the smell of home. For now, you press your perfumed handkerchief to your face and keep walking, wondering what other aromatic nightmares await in this pungent past. Section 4. You've been doing your best to adapt, clutching dried lavender like it's a lifeline, breathing through your mouth when possible. But now, it's time to tackle one of the most visceral aspects of medieval stench, the toilet situation, or rather, the complete and utter lack of one. Let's begin with the basics. There is no such thing as indoor plumbing, not for 99% of people, and even in the castles and monasteries that had some kind of toilet system, the term advanced is doing a lot of heavy lifting. You're walking down a narrow alley between two stone buildings when suddenly someone above you yells, "Gardyloo!" You don't speak French, but that's your warning. Incoming! A splash. A heavy splash. That wasn't water. See, chamber pots were the medieval answer to the bathroom. everyone had one. Every household, every tavern, every inn. If you had to go, you did it in the pot. Then, if you were responsible, you carried it outside and dumped it into the nearest street-side gutter or open. This led to an entire culture of smell masking, using herbs, vinegar, scented gloves and floral pomanders to overpower your own natural bouquet. It was the Axe body spray strategy, 600 years early. But the rich, they had their own way of smelling clean. Nobles used what were called dry baths. Picture yourself naked in a room while a servant sprinkles you with rose petals, then pats you down with cloths dipped in alcohol or herbal infusions. You're still filthy under the surface, but now you reek of lavender gin. Congrats. Still, medieval people did understand that dirt could be removed with water. They just didn't apply that idea consistently. A fun and frustrating contradiction. Monks and nuns were required by rule to bathe several times a year, 4 to 6 times, sometimes more depending on the order. That's right, cleanliness is next to godliness was actually on the books. But in practice, most monastic washing happened at key festivals or before communion, and even then only the hands and feet were prioritised. Of course, the peasants? They had other things to worry about, like surviving. You're toiling in the fields all day, sweating in the sun, digging in the dirt, and then collapsing at night in a shared one-room cottage. Bathing isn't on your to-do list. At best, you splash some cold water on your face in the morning. Maybe rub your armpits with a mint leaf. Done. And when you did finally get that rare, precious bath, it was a big deal. Sometimes the whole family would take turns in the same tub, starting with Dad, of course, then Mom, then the kids from oldest to youngest. By the time baby got in, the water was mostly brown soup. That old phrase, "Don't throw the baby out with the bath water." Yeah, not a metaphor either. Here's a curious little detail. The medieval people loved their feet. Not in a weird way. Okay, maybe a little weird. But in a hygienic way. Foot washing was a sign of humility, hospitality, and sometimes even eroticism. In many households, especially in noble ones, guests were offered warm water to wash their feet. You've got dirt caked up to your ankles, so it makes sense. Feet were like the medieval version of a handshake. Cleanish feet, good character. Crusty feet, something's off. Now, if you're thinking, well, maybe medieval women were cleaner? Not quite. Sure, women did a lot of laundry and housework, but their own bathing schedules weren't much different. In fact, during menstruation or after childbirth, women were often actively discouraged from bathing. It was thought to weaken the body or invite spirits in through the open pores. Instead, you'd be wrapped in warm cloths and left to stew in your own juices. Lovely, isn't it? Of course, not everyone agreed with these ideas. Even back then there were outliers, scholars, travellers and doctors who championed bathing. People who insisted that washing helped the body, lifted the spirit and calmed the mind. Islamic cities like Cordoba and Baghdad had fully functioning bathhouses, advanced plumbing and even written hygiene manuals. But the ripple effect across Christian Europe was slow, uneven, and often reversed by fear and superstition. This brings us to one of history's tastier debates. Were medieval folks aware that sanitation was linked to health? Some argue yes. After all, certain towns did have basic rules, like don't dump your waste in front of the baker's stall, or don't defecate in the churchyard. Violators could be fined, but others argue this was more about smell and decency than hygiene. The connection between germs and feces wouldn't really click until centuries later. To them, bad smell equals bad health, not the invisible organisms swimming in the brown stew under their feet. And yet some cities had early attempts at organised waste disposal. London, for instance, had open sewers called shitescapes. Yes, really. And official dumping grounds for human waste. Town officials employed rakers to clean the streets, though their effectiveness was inconsistent depending on how much they were paid, how motivated they were, or whether they had any functioning nose left. You're probably wondering, did they at least try to contain the smell? Well, yes. That's where the fragrant herbs came back into play. Sweet-smelling plants like rosemary, sage and marjoram were scattered across floors to mask the stink. In castles and churches, rushes, long grasses, were strewn across stone floors to soak up spills, waste, and the general miasma of humanity. These were rarely changed. They just layered new rushes on top of the old ones, like the world's most disgusting lasagna. You now find yourself standing on one of those very rush-covered floors, trying not to breathe too deeply. The rushes crunch under your boots, and you don't want to imagine what's hidden in the lower layers. You look up and spot a child sprinting by, barefoot, laughing, trailing the scent of something truly tragic. This is just life. You're the weird one here. Still, if you lived in this world, you'd adapt too. Your nose would dull, your standards would shift. You'd learn to step around the slickest parts of the road, carry your own sachet of herbs, and maybe, just maybe, you'd find a favourite alley that caught the breeze just right. But for now, you retreat back toward the open air, if such a thing exists in medieval towns, muttering a silent thank you to the modern marvel of plumbing. You're making your way through the tangled arteries of the medieval city now, and as your boots crunch over filth and straw, you notice something strange. Actually, you notice someone strange. A pig. A big one. Just trotting through the street like it owns the place, snuffling at a heap of vegetable peels and something that looks suspiciously like a boot. And it's not alone. Behind it, a trail of more pigs, a couple of dogs, and even a stray goat or two. This isn't a freak occurrence, this is business as usual. Because medieval cities weren't just human habitats. They were shared ecosystems, teeming with animals that made the streets smell like a barn fire doused with sour ale. Drain. If you weren't feeling particularly civic-minded, you might just chuck it out the window. Hence, Gardy-Loo, a slurred version of Garde-Lo. Watch out for the water. Except it wasn't water. It was last night's stew in its second form. For nobles and castle dwellers, things were only marginally better. They had the guard-robe, a closet-like protrusion overhanging the castle wall or courtyard, with a hole at the bottom. You did your business into the void, and it fell, hopefully, into a cesspit or the moat. Yes, you heard that right. Many castles had moats that doubled as sewage collectors. So the next time someone says the moats were to stop invaders, you can smugly remind them that they also had to wade through several feet of noble poop, which may have been a more effective deterrent. Now let's say you're visiting a bustling inn. You ask where the toilet is, and the barkeep points toward a dark corner with a battered curtain. Behind it, a shared chamber pot, possibly overflowing, surrounded by sawdust. It hasn't been empty since sunrise, and the smell hits you like a punch to the soul. You try to hold your breath, but that's a rookie move. You'll just end up inhaling deeper when you can't stand it anymore, and your lungs will fill with medieval regret. And what if you're caught outside without a pot? You find a quiet alley, a hedgerow, maybe a particularly shadowed nook between buildings. Public urination wasn't exactly frowned upon. It was more or less expected. Defecating in the open was common, though still rude if done in the wrong spot. There were designated dung heaps outside cities, but let's be honest, most people weren't making the long trek just to be polite. Here's a delightful fringe fact. Some particularly lazy or rich townspeople paid others to remove their waste. These workers were called gong farmers. That's right, an actual job title. Their role? To climb down into cesspits, shovel out human waste and cart it outside the city walls. It was dangerous, disgusting work, and yet it paid surprisingly well. Why? Because nobody else wanted to do it. You had to work at night due to the stench, wear full leather clothing if you could afford it, and hope that you didn't pass out from the gases and drown in muck. A bad day at the office took on a whole new meaning. Even monasteries, which were often considered cleaner than the surrounding cities, had their own quirks. Monks used a system of trench toilets, and the night soil was sometimes collected for fertiliser. The smell still lingered, but the communal belief was that it served a higher purpose, though no amount of divine justification could distract from the raw stench of a poorly maintained latrine. And here's where things get absurd. Not only was waste management primitive, but toiletry supplies were practically non-existent. You need toilet paper? Tough luck. Most people used moss, straw, leaves, or even their hand. In castles, bits of linen or wool might be reserved for the task, but again these were rarely washed, just rinsed and reused. In some parts of Europe, people kept communal sponges on sticks, which were, brace yourself, shared. Like a toothbrush, but for your other end. Between that and the open-air pooping, you begin to understand how disease spread so effortlessly. You were lucky, the vendor wrapped it in yesterday's bread. If you weren't lucky, you carried it home in a scrap of cloth and hoped it didn't turn to mush before dinner. Here's a weird fringe fact. Some towns allowed you to rent animals to carry your market haul home. Like a medieval Uber, but stinkier. You'd borrow a donkey or goat cart, lead it through the maze of stalls, load it up with slightly spoiled cheese and bruised turnips, and send it on its way, sometimes unaccompanied, back to your house. The animals knew the route, sort of. Occasionally they wandered off and just never came back. Meanwhile, the smell of the market mingled with everything else in the city. The human waste in the alleys, the animal dung on the road, the smoke from hearth fires, the tallow from candles burning in every window. It wasn't just bad, it was layered. A funk that evolved by the hour, depending on the wind, the weather, and what kind of fish had just arrived at the dock. Some cities tried to regulate it. There were ordinances banning the dumping of animal guts into public wells. Bakers could be fined for letting pigs inside their ovens. Yes, apparently that was a thing. Some stalls were required to sweep up at the end of the day, but enforcement was lax at best, and most people had other things to worry about, like avoiding starvation or sudden death via infected blister. And this is where the scholarly debate kicks in again. Historians argue over whether the medieval city was truly a cesspool or just misunderstood. Some claim that medieval folks were nose-blind to the stink, raised with it and thus desensitized. Others suggest that our modern disgust is shaped by 21st century hygiene standards that would have seemed downright alien back then. Maybe they didn't mind the pig in the street. Maybe that smell meant survival, but you're not from then. And as a time-travelling visitor, this moment hits you hardest yet. You step aside to avoid a rolling wheelbarrow full of spoiled fruit, only to plant your foot in something soft, warm, and unmentionable. You look up. The pig from earlier makes eye contact. You both understand the tragedy. You wipe your boot in the grass, not that it helps, and back away slowly. There's no escaping it. Not in the city, not in the countryside, not even in the churches where incense desperately tries to fight off centuries of wet wool and mortal sin. So now you know. Medieval life wasn't just lived among animals, it was blended with them. The smells, the sounds, the residues. Every path was shared, every surface was suspect, and while pigs helped eat the waste, they also left their own behind. Nature's circle of life, medieval edition. And somehow, despite all this, people survived. Not comfortably, not without consequences, but they lived, traded, cooked, and prayed among the stench, and many of them didn't even have shoes. You step back onto the main road, boots squelching a little, and keep walking, eyes watering, stomach turning, history getting much too real. Flushing clean water, you're just recycling a soup of sin. Some bathhouses even had open slots in the floor for direct contribution. If you're wondering why public baths fell out of favour, consider that image seared into your soul. As you leave the river behind, you're not just stepping away from a natural feature, you're stepping away from an entire world view. One where the line between waste and necessity was paper thin. One where survival meant coexisting with things we now sprint away from in horror. You pause at a bridge, one of the few crossings over the water. Below, the current churns with oily ripples and half-submerged mysteries. You hold your breath, not out of disgust this time, but out of awe. Because for all its filth, this river kept the city alive. Transport, drinking water, power for mills, a place to toss unwanted things. Literal and metaphorical. The river, for better or much, much worse, was the heart of the medieval city. And boy, did that heart stink. You step away from the river, stomach queasy and shoes probably ruined, thinking that maybe, just maybe, somewhere in this world, someone is clean. Not just disguised in perfume or standing under a holy incense burner, but actually functionally hygienically clean. But then you remember, in the medieval mind, too much cleanliness wasn't just suspicious, it was downright dangerous. Let's talk about that. Somewhere along the way, especially in the colder corners of Europe, bathing became not just rare, but morally questionable. You see, the dominant belief systems of the time weren't big fans of the naked body. Cleanliness might be close to godliness in the metaphorical sense, but actual soap and water bathing, that smelled a little too much like vanity, or worse, temptation. Because to get clean, you had to be naked, and being naked was a slippery slope to sin. So instead of daily showers, people clung to spiritual purity, while letting physical cleanliness slide right off them, like last year's festival garlands. This wasn't always the case. In earlier centuries, especially in the Roman era and the Islamic world, regular bathing was part of life, medicine, and even worship. But post-Roman Europe had a bit of an identity crisis. When the aqueducts fell and the marble bathhouses crumbled, a slow retreat from regular bathing began, and as Christianity grew in influence, so did the idea that bathing the body could be linked to indulgence, or worse, lust. Those who washed too often were considered self-absorbed, worldly, or scandalously flesh-focused. So instead, the focus shifted to washing souls. Physical dirt became a symbol of spiritual humility. Some monks and saints wore the same clothes for years, never bathed, and deliberately let their bodies deteriorate as a sign of piety. Picture a monk wrapped in coarse. You walk through a poorer part of town now, where people huddle in narrow doorways, bundled in rags, cooking over smoky fires that do little more than perfume the air with the scent of overcooked onions and grease. One man is trimming his toenails with a knife that looks like it was last used to carve a chicken. A woman scrubs her toddler's face with a piece of cloth that's almost black with soot. Her child cries, not from the roughness, but because the water is ice cold, pulled straight from a barrel outside. And yet, even here, in the shadow of filth and poverty, there's a strange kind of resilience. People aren't unaware of the smell, they're just used to it. You spot a girl combing her mother's hair with a wooden lice rake, carefully pulling through the tangles. They're not clean, but they're caring. Hygiene in the medieval world wasn't about sterilisation, it was about survival, a fringe belief that pops up in some corners of Europe around this time. Certain smells could protect you from evil. If you reeked in a particular way, say from sulphur, onions or vinegar, you might repel spirits, or worse, attract them, depending on who you asked. The line between sacred and rank was always shifting. Some even carried amulets filled with foul-smelling herbs, believing the aroma would ward off illness. You know things are bad when people are leaning into the stink as a defence mechanism. The deeper you go, the more you realise that filth wasn't just tolerated, it was codified, ritualised, woven into the fabric of daily life. Not because people loved being dirty, but because the system around them rewarded spiritual piety over physical purity. And because fear of sin, of lust, of death always carried a stronger smell than soap. As night creeps in, you watch candles flicker in the windows of homes that haven't seen a bucket of water in months. The smoke mingles with the scent of sweat, spilled beer, damp rushes, and whatever animal just died behind the bakery. You press your handkerchief tighter to your nose and wonder how anyone thought this was fine. But the truth is, for them, this was life, and the clean were the ones you worried about. By now you've probably figured out that medieval people weren't bathing often, or at all, but that wasn't always because they didn't want to. In fact, for a while, they absolutely did. Public bathhouses were once the closest thing medieval society had to a spa day, minus the relaxing music and scented candles, and plus the risk of syphilis. You turn a corner, and there it is. One of the last operating bathhouses in the city, its painted wooden sign swinging slightly in the breeze. It's faded, cracked, and probably hasn't seen a fresh coat in a few decades, but you can still make out the image of a steaming tub and a plump grinning man soaking up the medieval dream. You step inside. The bathhouse is dim, hazy with steam and lantern smoke, and filled with the muffled hum of voices splashing water and the occasional shriek of surprise. At first glance, it's almost cosy. Wooden tubs line the walls, filled with people of all classes and conditions, laughing, arguing, scrubbing themselves with rough cloths. There are bath attendants shuttling buckets of water from the furnace, pouring it into the larger communal pools. A heavy cloud of heat clings to everything. Your clothes stick to your back. The smell is not great. A bit better than the street, but still laced with body odour, wet wool and mildew. It's the scent of old sweat steeped in hot water and hope. Back in their heyday, around the 12th and 13th centuries, these bathhouses were popular across Europe. People came to wash, yes, but also to socialise, eat, and even do business. Imagine a tavern that also offered the occasional foot rub and back scrub. Some bathhouses provided food and drink alongside your soak. Beer steins clinked beside tubs. It wasn't uncommon to spend the better part of a day here, stewing in the same water as your friends and neighbours, making deals and discussing politics with one hand on a loofah and the other on a turkey leg. And the best part? Mixed bathing. Oh yes, men and women together, often nude or semi-nude, with only the faintest whisper of modesty separating relaxation from flirtation. It didn't take long for this setup to make the clergy very uncomfortable. What began as a practical place to wash your feet turned into something altogether more interactive. Bathhouses gained a reputation as places where one could, rinse the sin in more ways than one. The church noticed, and it hated it. Soon, bathhouses were getting hit with sermons, regulations, and sharp side-eye from local bishops. Some towns banned mixed bathing entirely. Others tried gendered hours, ladies in the morning, gents in the afternoon. But enforcement was sloppy, and temptation was high. Plus, bathhouse owners weren't exactly eager to turn away customers. A full tub meant full pockets, and the line between public bath and brothel got blurrier by the year. You now see one of the rooms off to the side, a private bathing chamber, candlelit, with a tub big enough for two. A soft voice drifts through the cracked door along with giggles and the splash of water. Yep, that's definitely not a spiritual confession. Here's the fringe fact for this evening. In some cities like Nuremberg, bathhouses came with a menu. Not just for food or water temperature, but for additional services. These were printed or painted on the wall with illustrations for those who couldn't read. Picture it. A bubbling bath in the centre, flanked by options ranging from bread and wine to light massage, to things that would absolutely get your YouTube channel demonetized. But even as bathhouses were being morally questioned, they also became scapegoats during times of illness. When the Black Death rolled through, public spaces became enemy territory. People believed that diseases spread through steam and scent, so a steamy room full of soot-hazed sky. And wonder how something so peaceful can exist above a world that's basically marinating in its own juices. Still, you breathe in the smoky air deeply and count your blessings. It's the cleanest thing you've smelled all day, so you've seen the bathhouses, the pig-infested streets, and the river that probably qualifies as a biohazard zone. By now your senses are shell-shocked, but you're hungry, which, let's be honest, is confusing under the circumstances, and that means it's time to explore the medieval marketplace's culinary offerings. Just brace yourself, because we're not talking about farm-to-table freshness here. We're talking farm-to-rotten plank to your mouth if you're lucky. You stroll back toward the market square where vendors are still shouting over one another like auctioneers on a sinking ship. The smells hit you before you even arrive. Overripe fruit, slightly off cheese, meat that's having a very public identity crisis. You catch a whiff of something sweet, almost promising, but it's immediately drowned by the pungent stench of vinegar, cabbage, and what can only be described as despair. First up is the fish stall. The fishmonger greets you with a toothless grin and a chunk of cod that looks like it's trying to evolve into a new species. It's been out in the sun since early morning, and the flies have claimed it as their kingdom. You ask how fresh it is, and he proudly declares it was caught just 3 days past, with the kind of confidence only someone noseblind could muster. He offers to sprinkle it with more salt, which is the medieval equivalent of CPR, but honestly, even the cats loitering nearby look unconvinced. You shuffle along to the butcher's table. There are animal parts hanging from hooks, some of which you can identify, some of which you pray you never do. Blood pools on the wooden planks coagulating under the heat, while flies engage in full-scale warfare over the choicest cuts. A severed pig's head stares at you blankly from the corner, eyes cloudy, tongue lolling. The butcher grabs a cleaver and slams it into a pile of bones with a theatrical flair. You flinch. He grins. Now let's talk about how this meat got here. In many cities, animals were slaughtered on site. No refrigeration, no clean processing facility, just a cart, a blade, and a patch of street. Blood and entrails were dumped into the gutters, mingling with human waste and rainwater, forming what could generously be called urban gravy. The meat was rinsed in the nearest water source, yep, that river again, and if it didn't smell too rancid, it was slapped onto the table for sale. There's a myth that medieval people were constantly getting sick from spoiled food, and sure, that happened. But here's the catch. They were also weirdly good at surviving it. They seasoned the heck out of everything. Pepper, mustard, vinegar, garlic, anything to kill or at least distract from the taste of rot. Spices were expensive, so common folks leaned on fermentation, pickling, and of course, salt. Salted meats were a staple, so chewy and preserved they could probably survive a siege and still be edible. Technically. Next, you pass the cheese stall. There's no refrigeration, so the smell is strong enough to startle birds out of the trees. A woman in a linen cap offers you a sliver of something she calls hard cheese, though cheese-flavoured brick feels more accurate. She assures you it's been aged to perfection. You're not sure if she means intentionally. Another wheel of cheese sits under a damp cloth, oozing slightly and humming in a way cheese absolutely shouldn't. You decline politely and move on, nose twitching. The bread vendor seems like a safe bet. Warm loaves stacked high, their golden crust catching the sunlight. You reach for one and quickly realise your mistake. It's not soft. It's hard enough to double as a weapon. This is black bread, made with coarse rye flour, often adulterated with filler like pea flour, ground bark, or even chalk. You bite a corner and instantly regret your life choices. It's edible, technically, but only just. You'd need soup to soften it, and that soup would probably contain more questions than ingredients. Still, it's better than the mouldy pastries at the next stall, where bees buzz drunkenly over a tray of sticky buns that have clearly seen better centuries. You overhear a customer asking whether the mould is the good kind. The baker hesitates. Never a good sign. Now, here's a fringe culinary fact that might put you off your snack entirely. Food fraud was rampant. Sellers sometimes mixed sawdust into flour or used ground-up bones to bulk out sausage. Some dyed spoiled meat with elderberry juice to make it look fresher. There were laws against this, but enforcement was spotty, especially if the local authorities were hungry too. You could end up with sausage that contained everything but the part of the pig you expected, or bread that crunched in a way flour shouldn't. And when people did fall ill from bad food, remedies were medieval in the purest sense. Vomiting on purpose, bleeding, or drinking antidote wine steeped with herbs. Sometimes the food itself was the medicine, a popular cure for stomach upset. Toasted breadcrumbs in wine, which sounds decent until you remember the wine might have been cut with vinegar and stored in a barrel shared with salted fish. This is where historians like to bicker. Some argue that medieval diets were healthier than we give them credit for. Lots of grains, fewer processed foods, very little sugar. Others say that while the diet looked good on paper, the reality was much rougher. Poor storage, unsafe preparation, and widespread malnutrition. Your average person may have had access to bread and ale, but vitamins, fibre, clean utensils? Good luck. You finally spot a vendor selling apples, tiny, misshapen, but mercifully not covered in fur. You bite into one, and it's tart, juicy, and glorious. Then you notice the child next to you casually wiping dirt from their apple onto their sleeve, which is already grey from days of wear. They grin and run off. And just like that, the magic dies a little. Semi-nude strangers practically screamed, "Welcome to Plague Town." Ironically, just as people needed more hygiene, they abandoned the one place where any was happening. Bathhouses began to shut down, or fade into seediness. The respectable ones either cleaned up their act, stopped being fun, or got absorbed into the growing underground network of brothels, inns, and apothecaries. The ones that stuck around struggled to balance cleanliness with survival. They had to drain and refill tubs constantly, which was expensive and difficult, especially without plumbing, or else accept that the water would at some point become soup. You glance at one of the tubs now. There's a thin film floating on top, a few errant hairs clinging to the rim. A man sits inside, eyes closed, humming softly as if he's in bliss. Maybe he is, or maybe he just can't smell anymore. A young woman nearby pours a bucket of steaming water into another tub and stretches her arms, revealing sleeves soaked halfway to the shoulder. Her apron is streaked with something brownish. You decide not to ask. For a moment you think, maybe this isn't so bad. A bath is a bath, right? And then your brain reminds you that people rarely change the water between customers. Many bathhouses had only one or two large tubs used all day by dozens of people. And you know what else floated in those tubs? Scabs, pus, lice, and sometimes blood from cupping treatments or shaving mishaps. You glance at the man in the corner having his head shaved with a blade so rusty it might qualify as tetanus on a stick. And yeah, the illusion dies fast. The debate among historians here is surprisingly rich. Were bathhouses mostly for hygiene or for socialising? Some argue they were primarily communal spaces, places to escape crowded homes and find warmth and company. Others insist their purpose was health-driven, cleanliness as part of a medical regimen, especially before surgery or childbirth. Still others believe bathhouses were essentially proto-pleasure houses, just with better acoustics and hotter water. And let's not forget the physicians of the time who had no chill. Some believed that steam from bathhouses opened the body's pores too wide, allowing bad humours to sneak in. Others argued that hot water weakened the flesh, especially for women, whose wombs were apparently a constant medical emergency. So naturally they recommended dry washing, wine-soaked compresses, or vigorous prayer over a good soak. You hear the bathhouse owner call out that the water's gone lukewarm and new firewood is needed. A young boy hauls a bundle of sticks past you, trailing the scent of smoke and sap. Somewhere behind you, someone drops a wine cup into the water. Nobody flinches, and yet, despite the risk, the smell, and the frowns of angry priests, people kept coming. Because the bathhouse was one of the few places where you could feel, if only for a few hours, almost human. You could stretch out, feel warm, feel cared for. You could forget, briefly, that the outside world smelled like rot and regret. You slip back outside, into the cooling night air. The scent of smoke clings to your clothes, but it's almost pleasant after the stew of the streets. You look up at the stars, pinpricks of light in the... Still, people made it work. Mealtimes were social, comforting, even joyful. Families gathered around hearths to eat stews made from yesterday's scraps, sopped up with crusty bread. Rich households feasted like kings, because they were kings, and poor ones stretched cabbage and lentils into miracles. Food wasn't sterile, it was living, fermenting, occasionally moving. But it was shared, and that mattered more than the stench. As the day winds down, you sit on a barrel at the edge of the square, munching your weirdly crunchy bread and watching a dog steal a fish head from an unattended cart. The vendor chases it, shaking his fist, but gives up halfway and just shrugs. It's the dog's supper now, he mutters, and returns to his post. You take another bite, trying not to think about bacteria, and look up at the sky. The air still smells like a compost bin married a slaughterhouse. But for a second, with the light slanting through the smoke and laughter echoing off the buildings, you almost get it. You almost understand how people could live with the stink, because they had no choice. And because, amid the rotting meat and questionable cheese, there was life. Loud, messy, stubborn life. You've made it through the marketplace with your stomach only mildly offended, and your dignity mostly intact. But don't get comfortable, because tonight you're heading into one of the most odoriferous corners of medieval existence, the battlefield. That's right, war wasn't just about swords and honour, it was a smelly, sweaty, gory mess that made everything you've seen so far feel like a lavender-scented dream. Picture this. You're a foot soldier, standing in a muddy field somewhere in France. It's dawn, the fog clings to the ground like a guilty conscience, and you've been awake for hours already, if you even slept at all. You're wearing the same tunic you've had on for weeks, your socks are damp, your armour is rusting in the armpits, and your entire body smells like old cheese and anxiety. This is the scent of readiness, apparently. Around you, hundreds of men shuffle, cough and spit into the mud. Horses snort nervously, releasing their own bouquet of dung and fear. Somewhere nearby, a squire is trying to relieve himself behind a bush, grumbling about oats and regrets. And you? You're trying to keep from throwing up because someone near you has just let out the most ungodly gastrointestinal sound you've ever heard, and the breeze is not in your favour. See, battles weren't just dirty, they were rank. First, there's the sweat. These men are carrying heavy weapons, wearing thick armour or padded gambesons, and standing in the sun for hours. Hygiene isn't an option. They don't bathe, they don't change clothes, and the padding under their chainmail is soaked through with every bodily fluid you can think of. Blood, sweat, spit, and stuff I won't even try to name. It's not a uniform, it's a portable swamp. Then there's the food situation, or rather, the lack of one. Soldiers ate salted meat, hard bread, and anything they could forage. Water was whatever they found in the nearest pond, river or puddle that didn't have a dead animal floating in it. Spoiled meat was common. Food poisoning was more likely to kill you than the enemy's blade. A knight might fall off his horse not from a lance but from diarrhea. Oh, yes, we're going there. Because if you really want to understand the medieval battlefield's aroma, you need to factor in the role of the human digestive system under stress. Soldiers, especially poorly trained levies and conscripts, often fought with full bowels. Some relieved themselves right in their armour, before, during or after the chaos. There are written accounts of soldiers losing control entirely during battle. soiling themselves in fear and marching onward without pause. And since nobody had spare undergarments tucked into their greaves, the results just lingered for days. You reach the front line and the real show begins. Trumpets blare, arrows fly, horses scream, the whole orchestra of destruction. Blood sprays, mud churns, and soon the stench of metal, hot, sharp, and unmistakable, joins the mix. Blood has a smell, and once you know it, you never forget it. Coppery, tangy. And when it mixes with sweat and feces, congratulations, you've discovered one of history's most unholy perfumes. Here's your quirky battlefield detail for the night. Some knights would line their helmets with herbs, lavender, thyme, mint. Not for aromatherapy, but to keep from gagging. Their noses were essentially under siege, and a sprig of rosemary was the only defence they had. Did it help? Probably not. But it made them feel better, like putting a sticker on a collapsing bridge. And let's talk about wounds. Clean cuts were rare. Most injuries were jagged, crushing, or grotesquely splintered. Flesh wasn't just cut, it was torn, shattered, or burned. Infections were inevitable. Gangrene was common, and without proper sanitation, battlefield medics did their work with dirty tools and blood-crusted fingers. Imagine getting sewn up by someone who's been elbow-deep in 3 other men already. No gloves, no antiseptic, just a dirty rag and a hope that your body would figure it out. One popular battlefield cure? Honey and cobwebs. I wish I were joking. Honey had mild antibacterial properties, and cobwebs were thought to stop bleeding. So if you were lucky, your open wound got stuffed with sweet bugs and dust. If you were unlucky, someone just licked it and hoped for divine intervention. As the fighting dies down and the sun begins to dip, the true horror sets in. The battlefield becomes a mass grave. Bodies lie twisted, armour twisted open, eyes staring blankly at the sky. The dead begin to rot almost immediately, especially in warm weather. Flies descend in thick clouds. The smell rises, not just of death, but of dying, which is worse. That sour, cloying scent of blood turned, mixed with the warmth of the day and the rot of spilled intestines. And the survivors, they stink too, not just from exertional wounds, but from fear. You know that phrase, the smell of fear? It's real. It's sweat mixed with adrenaline, sour and sharp, different from anything else the body produces. Entire fields reeked of it, mingled with the copper of blood, the sour milk of vomit, and the low, ever-present funk of unwashed bodies. There's a scholarly argument here, one that feels particularly relevant. Did medieval armies understand the health risks of unsanitary camps and medical tools? Some say yes. Military commanders often placed latrines downwind, and there were camp regulations about cleanliness. But others argue these were often ignored in the chaos, and real knowledge about germ theory wouldn't surface for centuries. So instead, they blamed bad air, bad luck, or divine punishment for infections and disease. And in the meantime, they just kept fighting, wounded, rotting, and reeking. You wander through what's left of the battlefield. A dead horse lies in the mud, bloated and swarmed with flies. A helmet sits crooked on the head of a man who no longer needs it. The smell of iron lingers in your nose and the ground squelches underfoot. In the distance, a campfire is lit. Someone's cooking something. You do not want to know what. And even as the carnage settles, the smell does not fade. It clings, it stains, it seeps into fabric, into skin, into memory. Soldiers often returned home not just traumatized, but pungent, smelling of war in a way that couldn't be scrubbed off. Their clothes, their hair, their gear, all saturated with the scent of violence and everything that comes with it. You step away from the battlefield, your breath shallow, your boots muddy, your mind heavy. This wasn't the romantic version of war. No banners waving in glory, just a stew of sweat, blood, and bodies. The stink of conquest. And you realise something grim. For all the honour sung in the songs, the real legacy of medieval war was the smell. It lingered longer than victory. You leave the battlefield behind, but the smell trails after you like a persistent ghost. You want to believe there's refuge somewhere, a patch of countryside untouched by blood or sewage or whatever that last odour was. So you follow a cart road, winding away from the noise and chaos of the city, hoping that a rural village might be if not cleaner, at least quieter. But you quickly discover that while the country air might carry fewer bodies, it's still not exactly a lavender-scented breeze. Welcome to medieval rural life, where people, animals and waste live together like one very dysfunctional family. The first thing you notice stepping into the village is that the animals aren't in the fields, they're everywhere. Chickens peck at your feet, goats bleat from under porches, a cow ambles through a narrow path between huts and leaves behind a steaming souvenir, a pig naps in a puddle beside a well, and no one seems to mind, because here, animals aren't visitors, they're roommates. This makes sense when you realise most peasants live in single-room huts. Wattle and daub walls, thatched roofs, earthen floors, no separate kitchen, no bathroom, no private sleeping quarters. Just one multi-purpose space shared by the entire household. And sometimes, the animals too. In the colder months, it's common to bring the livestock indoors at night. It keeps, and yet, nature is doing her best. There's green grass, there's a breeze, there's the soft murmur of bees somewhere in the distance, and because the village is small, the filth doesn't pile up quite as fast as it does in the city. People here know where their food comes from, and where their waste goes. There's a rhythm to it, a cycle. Eat, grow, dispose, repeat. You may not like the smell, but it's functional. It's honest. Historians like to argue about this. Was rural life really cleaner than urban life? Some say yes, pointing to smaller populations and more open space. Others say no, arguing that the lack of organised sanitation and reliance on close proximity to animals made villages just as ripe for disease. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in between. Less crowding helped, but no one was living in a spotless agrarian paradise. This was survival with a whiff of cow. There's another strange belief floating through the countryside that bad smells can actually ward off illness. You see an old woman hanging bundles of pungent herbs on the doorposts, not for beauty, for protection, against plague, against evil spirits, against the mysterious dangers carried on the wind. People wear small pouches of garlic or crushed rosemary around their necks. Some rub their bodies with vinegar before heading to town. To us it sounds like superstition. To them, it was medicine. You walk past a small wooden chapel, its door open. Inside, the smell is calmer. Beeswax candles, dried flowers, incense. A monk tends to the altar with gentle hands. You step in and let your nose rest for a moment. It's not clean exactly, but it's quieter, more intentional. The sacred has its own scent. Back outside, the wind picks up, lifting the stench of manure into the air and sending it drifting across the fields. A farmer waves from the distance, knee-deep in mud, swinging a hoe with a rhythm passed down for generations. His boots squelch. His shirt is soaked through, but he smiles, and in that moment, surrounded by filth and livestock and the unfiltered scent of human living, you understand something. They weren't trying to avoid the stink. They were trying to live through it. They had bigger problems than body odour, like hunger, cold, and death. So they didn't complain. They adapted. They carried the smell like a badge, a signal to the world that they were still here. You sit on a rock, squinting into the setting sun. It smells like manure and fire, and something cooking you hope isn't rat. But it also smells like life, messy, loud, persistent life. And for a second, you breathe it in. Not deeply, but enough. So by now you're probably thinking, okay, medieval life smelled like a compost heap inside a horse's mouth. Got it. But what if I told you, brace yourself, that sometimes the stench wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. That's right. In some corners of the medieval world smelling, you rise, brushing dust from your tunic, and head back down the path. The stars are just beginning to blink on, and a light wind carries the scent of wood ash, moss, and the fading trail of a very smelly saint. You've learned something today. Enlightenment? Maybe not, but definitely a deeper respect for nose plugs. Section 13. You've smelled cities. You've smelled peasants. You've smelled blood-soaked battlefields and dirt-covered saints. But now it's time to walk through a chapter of history where the stink wasn't just unpleasant, it was terrifying. Because when the Black Death arrived in Europe, the odour that came with it wasn't just a byproduct of decay, it was seen as a cause. You're about to walk into a world where people didn't just fear dying, they feared smelling death in the air. It begins in the streets. You're back in the city, but everything is quieter now. There's no music, no shouting vendors, no laughing drunkards spilling out of taverns. Just silence, broken occasionally by the creak of a cart or the tolling of a bell, and then you smell it. It's hard to describe. Rotten, yes, but also sweet, sickly. Like meat that's been left out too long beside a bed of wilting flowers and spilled wine. You don't even want to know where it's coming from, but you look down the street, and there's a man in a long cloak and a wide-brimmed hat, walking slowly, tapping a cane. He pauses beside a door marked with a red cross, then he moves on. The Black Death hit Europe in the 14th century and changed everything, including the way people understood smell. The popular medical theory of the time was miasma, the belief that diseases were spread through bad air. Foul smells weren't just unpleasant, they were considered deadly. The stink of a rotting body wasn't just a warning sign, it was the disease itself crawling through your nostrils into your bloodstream, and so the war against plague became a war against scent. You follow the man in the cloak. He's a plague doctor, though not the kind you see in those stylized museum illustrations with sleek leather coats and elegant beaks. This guy looks like a walking bundle of laundry held together by fear. But yes, there's the iconic mask, long, curved, bird-like. It juts from his face like a parody of a raven, the glass eyes staring without blinking. Inside that beak, stuffed herbs, lavender, myrrh, rose petals, cinnamon, vinegar-soaked sponges, anything thought to purify the air and block the miasma from entering. Some doctors carried small bottles of perfume or burned incense as they walked. Others simply held sweet-smelling cloths to their face and hoped it was enough. And the clothes themselves? Coated in wax or oil to make them more plague-proof. It didn't work, of course, but it made people feel like they were doing something. Them safe from theft and predators, and their body heat helps warm the home. But it also means your bedroom now smells like a barn, because it is a barn. You step inside one of these huts and immediately hit a wall of smell. Damp straw, wet wool, sour milk, ash from the central fire pit, old stew clinging to the rafters. It's not one overpowering stench, it's a complex layered bouquet of lived-in that no scented candle can touch. And the floors? Not dirt exactly. More like a compacted blend of earth, manure, ash, spilled food, and the collective history of the household's feet. Sometimes covered in rushes or straw, which are meant to absorb the worst of it, but really just trap it into layers. Think of it as a medieval carpet made of nature's regrets. The children run barefoot through the muck, chasing each other with sticks. One of them is chewing something. You don't ask what. A baby cries in the corner while a dog snoozes beside the hearth, twitching in its sleep. A chicken clucks from a beam overhead, casually dropping something you definitely don't want in your soup. Speaking of which, there's a pot hanging over the fire, bubbling slowly. It smells, okay, root vegetables, maybe dried beans. You see a hunk of something floating in it. Could be meat, could be optimism, could be yesterday's dinner trying to come back. Now, the average peasant didn't own much. A couple of bowls, a knife or two, one pot, maybe a single wooden spoon. Clothes were minimal, usually a single set per person, washed only when absolutely necessary, and hung to dry inside where it could absorb the house's natural ambience. Lice were a daily reality, fleas too. They weren't considered a problem so much as a fact of life. You scratched, you shrugged, you kept going. And yet, for all this, there was a strange kind of order to the chaos. Animal dung was collected and repurposed as fuel for the fire or as fertilizer for the garden. Human waste was typically dealt with in a shallow pit, occasionally moved or topped with ash. The smell? Constant but managed. Sort of. And in some households, special herbs were grown or gathered to help mask or cleanse the space. Wormwood, rosemary, mint. You see bunches of them hanging from the rafters now, drying slowly, their scent fighting a noble but doomed battle against the barnyard fog. Here's a delightfully quirky detail. Some rural families had communal beds, not just for the living, but for everything. Kids, parents, sometimes servants or neighbours, and very often fleas and rodents. The family pig might curl up under the blanket near your feet. The dog gets the middle. Someone always ends up snoring, and no one complains because everyone's warm and, at least for a while, not dead. Hygiene was a luxury, but warmth was survival. You wander outside, hoping for air, but the village paths aren't much better. Waste, both animal and human, is often tossed just outside the front door. Chickens peck through it looking for scraps. Children play disturbingly close to it. A man empties a bucket with a flick of the wrist, adding his own personal flavour to the growing sludge pile. He nods at you, friendly. You nod back, trying not to gag. Offal was seen not as a public health concern, but as a badge of spiritual honour. You're about to meet the olfactory saints, the people who embrace the funk in the name of holiness. You wander up a winding path into the hills, toward a small hermitage tucked between rocks and scrubby trees. It's peaceful here, no market shouting, no pigs rummaging through gutter stew, just wind and bird calls and the occasional creak of wood. The sun's lower now, and you catch a whiff of something sour and meaty that really shouldn't be up this high. And then you see him, a holy man, cloaked in rags, barefoot, skin darkened by the sun, eyes wild but clear. You think for a second he might be a beggar, but no, this is one of those rare individuals revered as a living saint, and wow, does he reek. It's not just sweat or dirt, it's the kind of smell that feels heavy, musky, fermented, almost cheesy, in a way that transcends cheese and becomes something else, something profound. You don't say anything, but he smiles, as if he knows what you're thinking. And maybe he does, because in this world his stink isn't a shame, it's a sign of how close he is to God. This wasn't some isolated weirdo in the woods, either. There was a whole genre of saintly behaviour that involved deliberately rejecting worldly comforts, including bathing. Many holy men and women believed that cleanliness was tied to vanity, that washing the body distracted from the soul, that perfume and fine clothing were traps for pride. So they did the opposite. They wore lice-ridden tunics, they slept in ash. They went years without a bath, and their followers, they were in awe. St. Cuthbert, for instance, reportedly lived for long stretches in complete isolation, wearing the same wool robe until it rotted from his body. St. Francis of Assisi wore rags and welcomed filth, considering physical decay a holy echo of Christ's suffering. St. Simeon the Stylite lived on a pillar for decades, exposed to the elements, wearing the same clothes until they fused to his body. Not metaphorically, literally fused. At that point you're not washing your tunic, you're evolving into it. But the most fascinating thing is how smell became a kind of divine indicator. Medieval texts describe saints whose bodies gave off sweet aromas after death. Seriously, corpses that, instead of rotting, allegedly released the scent of roses or myrrh. Scholars debate this, of course. Was it poetic symbolism, wishful thinking, or maybe the smell of embalming herbs mistaken for miracles? Either way, the belief stuck. Holy, fragrant. Earthly equals foul. And living saints who stank while alive were just being honest about how low they were willing to go for heaven. You watch now as the holy man kneels beside a stream, not to wash, but to pray. His feet are cracked and dirty. His beard is wild and tiny bugs flit around him like they've signed a lease. And yet, there's something peaceful about him. He's not suffering, he's devoted. And you realise that, in this world, the line between sanctity and squalor is razor thin. There's a quirky little belief that surfaces in some religious texts, that demons hate filth. You'd think it'd be the opposite, right? But no. In certain interpretations, the devil is drawn to vanity, pride, perfume, fine fabrics. So to live among dirt and stink was seen as a kind of divine camouflage. Angels in the muck, saints in the stink. Meanwhile, back in monasteries, you'll find a different kind of smellscape. Monks were expected to live simply, but that didn't always mean filth. Many monastic orders had rules about washing hands and faces, especially before prayer or meals. But full bathing? Rare. Communal latrines existed, often paired with small running water systems, and some monasteries were surprisingly advanced in their layout. But even the best-maintained cloister still smelled like wet stone, sour linens, ink, wax, and old vegetables. Inside, you see a monk brushing crumbs off a wooden table with his sleeve. He scratches absently at his scalp. His robe is heavy, layered, and probably hasn't seen soap in a season. But the room is quiet, reverent. The air smells like boiled turnips and beeswax. Better than the street, worse than a meadow. And yet, even here, with rules and rhythms, there's that quiet suspicion of cleanliness. Some monks avoided bathing during Lent or Advent. Others saw prolonged filth as penance, a sign of humility, of subduing the flesh. The idea was this: your body isn't the point, the soul is. So if your soul is shining, and your armpits are melting paint. That's still a win. It's not all spiritual, though. For some, smell was political. A bishop who refused the bath might be signalling austerity. A noblewoman who embraced dirt could be performing piety. You see this performative filth in the hagiographies, the lives of the saints, where grime is framed as holy armour. These stories describe lice as tiny martyrs, sweat as sacrament, odour as offering. It's all a bit much, but you can't deny the commitment. There's a modern scholarly debate about this. Were these saints actually that dirty, or were the stories exaggerated to make a point? Some historians argue that even the most famous ascetics probably washed occasionally, or at least wiped down. Others think these tales are metaphor, parables of humility, not hygiene guides. Still, the texts linger, and with them the idea that the holiest people on earth might also be the worst smelling. Back on the hillside, the holy man has stood and wandered off, muttering something about birds and divine winds. You're alone again, the sun sinking fast. You breathe in, and it's ripe, but not like the city. This stench is quieter, more personal, less assault, more background hum. It smells like wool and garlic and open wounds, maybe, but also earth, wind, wood smoke. And it's here you realise something very medieval. Smell wasn't just about comfort. It was about meaning, about faith, identity, ritual. Whether you are masking your scent with rose petals in court or cultivating filth in a cave to get closer to God, the smell wasn't accidental. It said something to others, to yourself, to heaven. And the scholarly debate? It's a juicy one. Some argue that the obsession with scent during the Black Death shows how misguided and superstitious medieval medicine was. Others say it's a testament to how intuitive people can be, even without modern science. They didn't know why the stench signalled danger, but they were right to be afraid of it. The nose doesn't lie. It just doesn't always explain itself. As night falls, you walk back toward the edge of town. The streets are empty now. A bell tolls in the distance, one ring for every soul lost that day. The air is heavy with the scent of burning herbs, but underneath it, always, is that same note, that dark sweetness, that warning. You stop and press a sprig of rosemary to your face, not because you think it'll protect you, but because in this world, it's the only comfort left. And maybe that's the cruelest thing about the Black Death. It didn't just steal lives. It filled the air with fear, soaked into the walls, the streets, the cloth, the lungs. For months, sometimes years, people lived not just with the knowledge of death, but the smell of it. Constant, unrelenting, final. You keep walking. Quiet now. Careful. Because here, if you can smell it, it might already be too late. You walk back through the village streets in the early morning mist, stomach tight, skin prickling with every breath. This scent of death still clings faintly to the corners of doorways and beneath your fingernails, but today you're not following disease. You're following the people who cleaned up after it. You're about to meet the unsung heroes of the medieval stench saga, the muckrakers, the nightmen, the gong farmers, the poor, unfortunate souls whose entire job revolved around digging through the worst humanity had to offer, and somehow coming out the other end alive, if not exactly clean. Let's be honest, this is the job nobody wanted. In a world where status was everything, being a gong farmer ranked about as low as it gets, just above leper and somewhere below town drunk. These were the men who collected human waste from privies, cesspits, and street-side trenches, often at night, to avoid offending the delicate sensibilities of the general population. Their title comes from the Old English gang, meaning to go. Cute, right? It's basically a polite way of calling them the guys who deal with your poop. You watch as one of them emerges from an alley with a cart and a long-handled shovel, whistling softly, like this is just another Tuesday. His boots are thick with grime, his gloves are stiff with use, and his face is half covered with a cloth that has clearly lost the battle against the smell. Behind him is a wooden barrel sealed with wax, partly to keep the contents in, partly to keep the flies out. Not that it works. You turn down a narrow alley. A corpse lies beneath a blanket, bloated and beginning to liquefy. A few people pass by, noses covered, eyes averted. There are too many bodies to bury quickly, too many to treat, so they pile up, on carts, in side yards, in abandoned homes, and the smell grows. People stuff windows with herbs and cloth, hang posies from their door frames, even light small fires to mask the stench. But nothing helps for long. And here's the deeply uncomfortable truth. This fear of smell wasn't entirely wrong. Sure, they didn't understand bacteria or viruses, but foul odours did often accompany infectious environments. Filth, decay, stagnant water, these were all breeding grounds for disease. They weren't the root cause, but they were definitely co-conspirators. So when someone said, "I smelled it before I got sick," they weren't imagining things. Their nose was just sounding the alarm, even if science hadn't caught up yet. In one street you find a family frantically scrubbing their doorstep with vinegar. The mother shouts at her children to bring more rosemary. The father tosses something burning into a brazier, muttering prayers under his breath. They've heard that heat and scent might cleanse the air, that if you boil enough vinegar or smoke enough sage, the sickness can't find its way in. And in some parts of Europe, towns went even further. Streets were fumigated, bonfires were set at every corner. Public gatherings were banned, not just to avoid crowding, but because too many people in one place meant too many smells. Cities issued edicts demanding residents keep their homes clean and sweet-smelling. Apothecaries made fortunes selling perfume, herbs and so-called plague preventatives, some of which were just alcohol in fancy bottles. You stop at a market stall where a merchant is still selling little nosegays, bundles of flowers and herbs meant to be carried under the nose. They're wrapped in cloth and tied with string, worn like amulets. A child clutches one to their face with both hands, eyes wide with fear. You recognise the rhyme forming in your head. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies. It's not about skipping and sunshine. It's about plague, about the smell, about a desperate childlike hope that flowers can keep death at bay. And of course, people turn to the church. You pass a chapel where incense burns constantly. The priests wear masks not of leather, but of linen soaked in rosewater. The air is thick with smoke and prayer, but the sickness still comes. It moves silently, invisibly, through streets and homes and hearts. And when it does, the smell is the first thing people notice. That sweet, strange odour, the breath of the dead. Here's your fringe fact for the night. Some doctors claimed you could prevent plague by surrounding yourself with strong-smelling things, like goats or even human waste. Yes, you read that right. Some desperate souls believed the stink of dung could fight off the stink of death. They'd smear themselves with excrement or live near latrines, hoping the strong odours would overpower the bad ones. Imagine trying to win a house fire by lighting another fire inside your living room. Animal waste was used in poultices. Human urine was collected and aged to create ammonia-rich cleaning agents or tanning solutions. That yellow jug in the corner of the workshop, not lemonade. Definitely not. You pause near a small field where a group of children is playing a game that involves tossing dried cow patties at each other like frisbees. One girl catches hers mid-air and whoops in triumph. No one scolds them. No one looks concerned. Dried dung is just part of the scenery. It's fuel for fires in the winter, bedding for animals, insulation for walls. It's not waste, it's building material. Here's a lovely little fringe fact. Some medieval homes actually used compressed manure bricks for insulation in walls and roofing. When dried and sealed with mud, they created a surprisingly effective layer of protection against cold and wind. And yes, they retained a faint aroma, but after a while you probably didn't notice, or you just told yourself it was rustic charm. This brings us to a strange little contradiction. In a world terrified of bad smells, miasma, sin, disease, people still lived neck-deep in substances that made the air curdle. But the key difference was purpose. Filth left to fester. Dangerous. Filth repurposed for agriculture, medicine or fuel. Useful. Even holy. Waste was only truly revolting when it lacked a role. Give it a purpose, and suddenly it was part of the divine cycle of life. You stand at the edge of a manure field now, staring out at rows of budding cabbage and onions. The air is thick with the smell of decomposition and effort, but you can't deny it. The plants are thriving. The food is growing. The system, crude and foul and somehow genius, is working. And maybe, just maybe, the smell doesn't bother you as much anymore. You turn to leave, passing by a young boy pushing a cart full of straw and dung. He grins at you, nose wrinkled, hands filthy. "Good stuff," he says proudly. "Real fresh." and you nod. Because out here, fresh means something very, very different. The village fields shrink behind you, and you start walking back toward the city, towards stone walls and that uniquely medieval combination of ambition and mildew. It's midday, and while the sun brings out the flies in full force, it also dries out the mud and manure on your boots, creating a lovely new crust of scented history you're sure will never come off. But you're not here to complain. You're here to explore one of the great underappreciated layers of medieval life, the scent inside the home. You've already seen the mess outside, the chamber pots, the pigs, the stew of human and animal fluids that makes every street corner a guessing game. But what about indoors? What did a home really smell like when you weren't outside dodging sewage? But here's the uncomfortable truth. Even with gong farmers doing their best, most medieval cities stank. The scale of waste was too much, the infrastructure too basic. Cesspits overflowed, drains backed up, and heavy rains turned entire streets into rivers of muck. Even noble houses weren't immune. Some castles had murder holes where servants would dump chamber pots directly into the moat. Yes, the moat. That romantic body of water, actually a floating sewer. Swim at your own risk, and don't think gong farmers were immune to disease either. They were constantly exposed to pathogens, animal waste, spoiled food, and chemical runoff from tanning, dyeing and brewing. Many didn't live long. Their work clothes rotted quickly. Their tools corroded. Some lost their sense of smell entirely, which might have been a blessing. There's a scholarly argument about how effective these early sanitation systems really were. Some say they were surprisingly advanced for the time, pointing to designated dumping zones, street cleaning ordinances and waste management contracts. Others argue it was all patchwork, barely functional, mostly ignored and frequently overwhelmed. The truth likely depends on the city, the century, and whether the local officials actually enforced the rules. As you stand there, watching the waste settle into the soil, you can't help but feel a strange admiration for the gong farmer. He nods to the farmer, wipes his brow and heads back into the city. His barrel empty, but his nose still curled. He doesn't get songs, he doesn't get statues. But without him, the city would drown in its own filth. And maybe that's the real lesson here. In a world without flush toilets, garbage trucks or hand sanitizer, someone had to keep the stink from winning. And while the nobles doused themselves in rosewater and the priests prayed over incense, it was the man with the shovel who actually did the dirty work. You watch him disappear into the fog, a quiet hero in boots that will never, ever come clean. It's the next morning now, and the city is already waking up in its usual cacophony of stink and bustle. You've seen the dung collectors, the battlefield stink, the saintly musk of the pious unwashed. But now, you're about to enter a zone where things get even weirder. Because while you've come to associate medieval waste with, well, disposal, that wasn't always the end of the story. Sometimes, waste was treasure, and in more ways than one, dung was currency. Today, you're going to explore the odd, surprisingly strategic world of medieval manure, and the lengths people would go to get their hands on it. You start in the stables behind a tavern, where a stable boy is shoveling fresh piles of horse manure into a wheelbarrow like he's collecting firewood. He's not grimacing. In fact, he's whistling. Because this isn't a chore, it's a resource. In a world without synthetic fertilizer, dung was agricultural gold. It made plants grow, restored depleted fields, and if managed correctly could even ward off crop failure. Farmers prized it. Landowners hoarded it. Entire arguments erupted over who had the right to collect it. Most cesspits were located in the rear of buildings or under public latrines. They were holes in the ground lined with stone or brick, sometimes covered with wooden planks or stone slabs. When they filled up, and they always did, someone had to empty them. That someone was our friend with the shovel. He'd climb down into the pit, knee-deep or worse in centuries of accumulated waste, and scoop it out by hand into buckets or barrels. The smell was said to be so strong it could knock a man unconscious. Some wore leather hoods, stuffed herbs into their collars, or drank heavily beforehand. A medieval version of pre-gaming, but with lower odds of survival. Here's where it gets weird. Despite the horror of the job, gong farmers were actually well paid. In some cities they earned more than skilled craftsmen. Why? Because nobody else would do it, and it was essential. If the cesspits weren't emptied regularly, the waste would overflow into the streets, seep into basements, and turn entire neighbourhoods into open-air latrines. The job was disgusting, dangerous, and thankless, but it was critical. And if you were strong, unbothered by smell, and didn't mind being socially invisible, it paid. You follow the gong farmer now as he hauls his barrel through the streets toward the city's edge. He passes by people who politely look away or cross to the other side. Some children point and laugh, a few men raise their eyebrows in grim appreciation. He doesn't respond. He's heard it all. He's seen things that would make a knight cry. His job keeps the city functional, even if no one wants to admit it. And where does all this waste go, you ask? Into the countryside, into designated dumping grounds outside the city walls. Sometimes it's buried, sometimes it's mixed with straw and allowed to compost, and sometimes, brace yourself, it's sold. That's right. Human waste was valuable. Farmers called it night soil and used it to fertilise fields, and while it wasn't quite as desirable as animal manure, it still got the job done. So our friend with the barrel? He's not just a shovel-wielding outcast, he's a supplier, a distributor of premium-grade peasant poop. In fact, in some towns, this waste economy was a fully organised operation. Contracts were drawn up, routes assigned. Some gong farmers worked directly for the city, others as freelancers. You could even inherit the job, though I'm guessing no one fought over the family shovel. There's a fringe fact here that's just too bizarre not to share. In some places, the gong farmers were required by law to only work at night, to avoid offending decent citizens with the sight and smell of their labour. They became almost mythical figures, part of the urban landscape's underworld. You didn't see them, but you smelled their absence when they didn't show up. You reach the city edge now, where the barrel is tipped out into a shallow trench. The smell rises in a slow, choking wave. Flies descend like tiny vultures, but within minutes a farmer approaches with his own cart, ready to load up the composted sludge and haul it to his fields. Waste becomes crop, crop becomes food, food becomes waste again, a perfect cycle if you ignore the dysentery. Well, let's go in. You duck through the low doorway of a modest townhome, 2 stories narrow, built with timber beams and wattle and daub. The first thing you notice isn't the decor or the furniture, it's the air, thick, still, close. There's no chimney, just a small hole in the roof for smoke to drift out of, which it does in theory, but mostly it just hovers, clinging to the rafters and making every breath feel like you're sipping on an old campfire. The hearth is the heart of the home, and it burns all day, not just for cooking but for warmth and light. The fuel? Wood, sure, if they're lucky. More often it's dried dung, peat or coal, depending on what's cheap and available, and that has a smell, not entirely unpleasant, but definitely assertive. Think earth, musk, and the lingering perfume of charred barn. The smoke curls through every room, settling into fabric, hair, walls. The effect is part warm nostalgia, part unfiltered lung damage, and there's no escaping it. Medieval homes didn't have windows as you'd recognise them, just small slits covered in cloth or animal horn to let in light while keeping out cold. Airflow, optional. Now turn your attention to the rushes. You've heard of them. Straw or long grass spread over the floor to soak up spills, dirt and, let's not kid ourselves, bodily fluids. But here's the twist. They aren't cleaned. Not really. Maybe once a season someone rakes out the top layer and adds fresh material, but underneath, that's a time capsule of filth. Crumbs, rat droppings, flea eggs, urine, ash, grease, and a few generations of toe jam. People walk barefoot on these. Babies crawl on them. You stare down at the floor and think, this is not a rug. This is a science experiment that got out of hand. Moving on. You peek into a pantry, or what passes for one. It smells like preserved fish, musty flour, onions, and a faint hint of mouse. The shelves are rough wood, and everything's stored in sacks, crocks, or wax-sealed jugs. There's no fridge, obviously, and no cool basement, so things spoil, constantly. But when they do, you don't toss them. You scrape off the worst parts and keep going. Cheese with mould? Fine. Bread with a bit of green? Just toast it. Pickle cabbage that smells like regret? Still good. Probably. Upstairs the smell is different. A bit less smoky, a bit more human. It's the smell of unwashed sheets, stale breath, old wool, and a dozen years of candle smoke. Bedrooms, if the house is lucky enough to have them, aren't private. Entire families share one bed, sometimes including servants or guests. You lift a blanket and instantly regret it. The linen is brownish, stiff in places, and it smells like someone's been sweating into it since Christmas. And they have. Clothes are hung on pegs or folded into chests, but again, don't think fresh laundry. Most people own one, maybe two sets of clothing. They're rarely washed, just brushed clean, and it wasn't just horse poop. Cow dung, pig droppings, chicken guano, it all had value. Even human waste, when aged properly, was repurposed as night soil for the fields. So imagine this. You're a peasant with a few animals and a small patch of land. Your neighbour has a larger pasture but fewer cows. They notice your compost heap growing tall and, let's say, fragrant. And one night, under cover of darkness, they come by and steal your dung. Yes, medieval poop theft. It happened more than you'd think. In fact, city councils and manorial courts across Europe issued actual legal rulings about stolen manure. There were boundary disputes over dung heaps, charges of trespassing with a wheelbarrow and shovel. One town in England in the late Middle Ages even posted guards near the communal midden pile, because enterprising citizens were sneaking in to scoop up the good stuff. You make your way toward the edge of the city, where the air shifts into something different. Earthier, not necessarily fresher, but at least less human. This is where the fields begin, and it's here that waste is rebranded, not as garbage, but as fuel, as life. The compost piles are massive, steaming slightly in the cool morning air. Layers of straw, manure, food scraps and ashes are carefully tended, turned with pitchforks, and occasionally sprinkled with lime to help break it all down. You spot a farmer with a suspiciously nice cloak for someone ankle-deep in muck. Turns out he's not just a farmer, he's a manure broker. His family owns several dung rights in nearby stalls and latrines, and he's here to sell aged manure to a local abbey garden. The monks pay well, and they pay in bread and honey as well as coin. Who knew being the poop guy could make you one of the wealthier men in town? And this is where the scholarly intrigue kicks in. Some historians argue that the careful management of manure was part of what kept medieval agriculture afloat. That, for all the inefficiency and poor hygiene, peasants had an intuitive understanding of soil science. They knew which kinds of waste nourished which crops. They rotated their fields. They used compost long before it had a name. It wasn't pretty, and it definitely didn't smell good, but it worked. You walk past a long trench where farmers are spreading slurry over rows of soil. It's thick, grey-brown and very much alive. Flies swarm above it, and the odour hits you like a wet sock filled with old garlic. But the farmer smiles, hands on hips, looking over his land like a proud king surveying his kingdom. Good harvest this year, he says. Smells right. Of course, not everyone had access to manure. Urban households with no animals had to buy it, or get creative. Some used ashes from their hearth, crushed bones, or even sand mixed with fish guts to enrich their soil. And in times of famine, even dung was hard to come by. There are records of people watering down manure to make it stretch further, which is exactly as disgusting as it sounds. And then there were the more unorthodox uses of dung. Some apothecaries included it in medical treatments. Donkey dung, mixed with vinegar, was believed to cure infections. Brunty, aired out. Under things get a little more attention, but even those are rinsed rather than truly scrubbed. The result is that people don't just look lived in, they smell lived in. Deeply, thoroughly. You step into the washroom, or more accurately the wash corner. A wooden tub sits beside the wall, cracked and worn, next to a shelf with a single bar of lye soap that looks more like a weapon than a cleanser. You imagine how long it would take to haul water from a well, heat it over the hearth, and fill that tub. Hours. No wonder people skipped baths. It wasn't laziness, it was logistics. A full-body soak was a luxury, save for saints' days or when your life situation crossed a personal threshold. Here's a quirky historical touch. Some homes kept dried herbs hung in bunches from the rafters, not just for cooking, but to freshen the air. Lavender, mint, wormwood. When the house started smelling like a foot trapped in a wool sock under a cheese wheel, you'd just crush a few leaves and scatter them into the rushes. It helped. A little. Sometimes. There were other tricks too. Burning rosemary was thought to cleanse the air. So was sprinkling vinegar on hot coals to release a sharp, eye-watering scent that temporarily overpowered the underlying must. People even waved around small pots of smouldering herbs as makeshift air fresheners. You see a child doing it now, walking in circles, waving a cracked clay bowl with smoke wafting out like a tiny exorcist. The family dog follows behind, tail wagging, clearly not bothered. And then there are the chamber pots. They're in every home, tucked under beds or benches, waiting to be used. At night, no one walks to the privy outside. You just go in the pot, cover it, and empty it in the morning. Maybe. Hopefully, if you remember, if you care. Sometimes the contents sit a little too long, and when that lid comes off, the house gets its own sunrise. Now here comes the scholarly debate. Were medieval people totally oblivious to how bad it smelled? Or had they simply built a different relationship with scent? Some argue they'd developed a tolerance, a kind of nasal callus. Others suggest smell carried social meaning. The aroma of a clean home wasn't necessarily one free of funk, it was one with the right type of funk. A smoky hearth, dried herbs, freshly baked bread, acceptable smells, comforting smells. But rot, spoiled meat, damp mould, those crossed a line. You look around this home again with new eyes. Yes, it's musty. Yes, it's claustrophobic. But it's also alive. Children laugh. A mother stirs a pot. A father sharpens tools near the fire. The smells blend into something holistic. Not pleasant, but present. A living signature. And as you step outside again into the sharp light and street stink, you realise something strange. You miss it already. The smoke, the herbs, the warm must of people packed together. It wasn't clean, but it was theirs. Intimate, honest. You take one last breath and rejoin the crowd outside where the smell returns to full volume. Congratulations. You've now survived the medieval indoor air experience. Just don't expect your clothes to ever recover. The city seems to breathe differently as the sun dips toward the horizon. If breathing means exhaling a warm blend of smoke, garlic, and exhausted humanity. You're being pulled now not by curiosity but by hunger. The kind that comes after walking for miles through filth and folklore. And tonight, you're going to a feast. That's right, a full-blown multi-course medieval banquet. But don't get too excited, because here, even the nobility couldn't entirely escape the stomach-turning symphony of medieval stench. In fact, sometimes they were the source of it. You arrive at a manor house on the edge of town. Stone walls, banners fluttering, guards at the door. Your standard highborn setup. You're ushered in by a servant who smells like rosewater and armpit, which, to be fair, is better than the street outside. The great hall is already buzzing. Long wooden tables are laid out with trenchers. Those are flat, day-old hunks of bread used as edible plates, and the air is thick with the scent of roasted meat, candle wax, and unwashed silk. You find a seat near the edge, surrounded by people in layers of heavy clothing that hasn't seen soap in at least a fortnight. Perfume helps, sort of. Everyone reeks of effort. But what they lack in hygiene, they make up for in enthusiasm. This is a feast after all, and it doesn't happen every day. The first course arrives. Spiced wine, sweetened with honey and infused with herbs. It's warm, cloying, and surprisingly pleasant, until you realise it's covering the taste of whatever's floating in the cup. You politely sip around it. Then the food begins to arrive in waves. Roasted peacock, feathers reattached for dramatic flair. Brawny haunches of pork glistening with fat. Fish stuffed with spices and raisins. Pies filled with pigeon, eel, or something that might once have been a rabbit. The scents are rich, oily, and often a little off. Because remember, refrigeration doesn't exist. Meat is kept in salt, smoked, or simply hung somewhere coolish. Even the castle kitchen, big as it is, can't hide when something's been sitting a bit too long. But no one says a word. Because this is luxury. You tear into a trencher of beef stew, and the flavour is a strong mix of clove, vinegar, and what you're pretty sure is nutmeg. Spice was a status symbol. The more spice, the richer you looked, even if it meant your stew tasted like a scented candle. It wasn't just about flavour, it was about masking. If your meat was questionable, you buried it under cinnamon and hoped no one noticed. And here comes the fun part, the noble digestive system. Let's just say, subtlety was not a medieval strength. People ate with gusto. They gorged themselves on greasy meats, heavily spiced sauces, thick pies, and sweetmeats. Then they burped, they passed gas, and sometimes they just let it out. Loudly, in public. Right there at the table, a massive belch could even be seen as a compliment to the cook. One man leans back beside you and releases, "Smells like if someone turned incense, pickled fish, and feet into a paste." She beams. "Very powerful," she says. You nod, very pale. You thank her and step outside, gulping fresh air like it's holy. The breeze doesn't smell great, but at least it doesn't make you hallucinate. The apothecary waves from the doorway, and you realise, despite the smells, the grime, the terrifying use of goat bile, she's trying. She's fighting death with whatever she has, and that takes guts. As you walk down the street, the scents of medicine fade into the larger stew of city life, but they've left their mark. Because now you don't just recognise the smell of vinegar or mould, you understand it. You know that beneath the rot was an attempt at healing. Behind the stink was survival, and honestly it smelled better than some of the feasts. The moon is higher now, pale and swollen like an overripe fruit hanging in the velvet sky. You're walking slowly, trying to give your stomach a break from that last concoction of medicinal horror, when you hear it, a hollow clop of boots on cobblestone, deliberate, echoing. Then, from a side street shrouded in mist and chimney smoke, a strange figure emerges. He's tall, cloaked in black, face hidden behind a long hooked beak. He looks like a bird that took a vow of silence and joined a funeral procession. And just like that, you're face to face with one of the most iconic silhouettes of medieval plague time lore. The Plague Doctor. You've seen drawings, you've seen bad Halloween costumes, but standing in front of you, he's terrifying. Not in a jump scare kind of way, but in a something is very wrong with the air way. His mask juts forward like a spear. The round glass eye holes catch the moonlight. He carries a cane, not to walk with, but to prod people from a distance, like a grim medical conductor orchestrating his rounds. And of course, it smells. The beak isn't just theatrical, it's functional. In the hollow cavity are layers of herbs, flowers and spices. Things like dried rose petals, camphor, cloves, myrrh, mint and even vinegar-soaked sponges. An aromatic defence system against the so-called miasma, the bad air believed to carry the plague. He smells like an overstuffed sachet of potpourri left to marinate in fear and goat leather, and it's working, in its own twisted way. You can barely smell the city anymore, just the musty, cloying, overripe scent of trying very hard not to die. He walks past without a word, his presence scattering the few remaining townspeople on the street. They close shutters, draw curtains, whisper prayers. The sight of a plague doctor doesn't inspire confidence. It's a signal that someone, somewhere nearby, is dying. Maybe already dead, just from sweat. But from layers of spilled food and the general dampness of the hall, you try to subtly peel yourself free. As the host races a final toast, everyone lifts their cups. You join in, because that's what you do. And as the wine sloshes and someone nearby emits an audible and unapologetic release of gas, you realise, this is medieval fine dining. No forks, no rules, just feast, fart and forget. And maybe a rinse with rosewater if there's any left. You step out of the great hall into the night air, head buzzing from wine, stomach slightly uncertain, and nose thoroughly abused. You'd think the cool breeze would bring relief, but all it does is stir the layers of odour already clinging to your clothes like stubborn spirits. You try to shake it off, literally, but there's no escaping it. Not in the streets, not in your shoes, and certainly not in your sinuses. But tonight isn't over. Not yet. You still haven't experienced one of the most potent contributors to the medieval scentscape. Medicine. Yes, medicine. The thing that's supposed to help you, heal you, comfort you. Instead, in the Middle Ages, it often smelled like a spoiled lunch left in a hot cart for 3 days, and you're about to find out why. You walk toward a modest-looking building tucked near the monastery wall, where a wooden sign carved with a mortar and pestle swings gently overhead. A small apothecary shop. Inside, candles flicker against shelves crammed with jars, sacks, vials, bundles of dried plants, and something in a bowl that appears to be melting. The smell hits you like a slap in the face. Sour vinegar, fermented garlic, crushed herbs, something sulphurous, and hauntingly something faintly meaty. A woman greets you with a polite nod. She's the apothecary, and she has the calm confidence of someone who has seen every bodily fluid a human can produce, and probably bottled half of them. She wears a robe stained with countless unidentifiable blotches, and a sprig of mint tied around her wrist, likely not for style, but survival. You ask what she's working on, and she grins, lifting a ladle from a bubbling pot that smells like rancid soup gone wrong. A cure for excess phlegm, she explains. Requires badger fat, vinegar, mustard seed, and a touch of boiled urine. You blink. She stirs. This was the norm. Medieval medicine wasn't just herbal, it was organic in ways that defy modern comfort. Remedies were often made from whatever was available: plants, minerals, animal parts, and bodily fluids. You see jars labelled with names like dragon's blood, mummy powder, and essence of toad, and those are the tame ones. She shows you a dried fox liver, used in potions for colds, a bowl of leeches still squirming, a sack of ground oyster shells, a jar of oil with something floating in it that looks suspiciously like an eyeball. The longer you stand here, the more your stomach curls inward. Every smell, something so thunderous it startles a nearby dog. He wipes his mouth with his sleeve and smiles. You try to keep eating. A servant scurries by with a wooden bucket. No, not for waste, for vomit. Because when guests overindulged, and they always did, it was common practice to purge mid-feast to make room for more. Some even carried scented cloths to cover their faces while retching, which is the medieval version of classy. You witness it happen across the table. A man in a feathered hat leans aside, lets it go discreetly into a basin, and then calmly resumes eating. You have to admire the commitment. And it's not just people's bodies adding to the atmosphere. The feast itself is a riot of smells. Roasting fat drips into the fire, sending up choking waves of smoke. Bowls of pickled onions, garlic sauces, and mustard line the table. Someone spills a goblet of wine onto the rushes, where it soaks into a mat already thick with grease, crumbs, and trampled poultry bones. The dog under the table doesn't mind. He's having the time of his life. The smell of all this, rich food, sweat, candles, spilled drink, and the unmistakable sharpness of digestion, builds into something heavy. It presses on your chest. This isn't just a meal, it's an assault. The food is good, the company is lively, but the stench, it's relentless. Here's your fringe feast fact. Sometimes people brought their own napkins, not cloth ones, but small fur or velvet strips attached to their belts. They dab their mouths, wipe their hands, maybe even press it to their nose if things got out of control. The wealthier the guest, the fancier the fabric. You spot one lady holding a lace-trimmed kerchief soaked in something floral. Every few minutes she gently wafts it past her face like a delicate fan. She still looks mildly nauseated. The debate among historians is always the same. Were medieval nobles really this disgusting, or is it an exaggeration? Some argue that upper-class hygiene was significantly better, citing scented baths, herbal oils, and ornate grooming sets found in archaeological digs. Others insist that while the trappings were there, the execution was inconsistent at best. Sure, you had a golden comb, but when was the last time you actually used it? You lean back as dessert is served. Syllabub, candied almonds, and a moulded jelly shaped like a castle tower. The sugar is gritty, the wine is sharp, and everything is slightly sticky. Someone across the table hiccups, then stands to leave, probably heading to the latrine, which based on its location and maintenance could knock out a mule. And yet no one here complains. They're used to it. More than that, they enjoy it. The feast is a show, a ritual, a spectacle of wealth and endurance. If your senses weren't under attack, what was even the point? Outside, you hear a minstrel tuning a lute. Music drifts in, but so does the scent of pigs rooting through kitchen scraps in the alley. The line between grandeur and grime is paper thin. You shift in your seat and realise the back of your tunic is sticking to the bench. Not from sweat, well, not. Competes for dominance. Spicy, rotten, acrid, earthy. It's less of a bouquet and more of a battlefield. You flip through a tattered medical manuscript left open on the counter. The recipes, if you can call them that, are written in shaky Latin. One recommends rubbing goose fat on your chest and stuffing a clove of garlic up your nose to treat coughing. Another calls for heated dung of a cow, applied to the feet, to draw out fever. There's even one that insists menstrual blood, when consumed under the new moon, can cure melancholy. You take a step back. The thing is, people truly believe these treatments worked, and sometimes they did. Herbs like yarrow, lavender, and chamomile had genuine medicinal properties. Vinegar was a mild antiseptic. Honey could prevent infection. The problem was the rest of the recipe: the eye of newt, the goat bile, the powdered oyster shell, and the smell that came with it. You follow the apothecary as she leads you into a back room where a patient lies on a table, groaning softly. The room is warm, rank with the sharp bite of blood and sweat. She lifts a cloth from the man's leg and the wound underneath is angry, swollen and leaking something that should not be leaking. She tuts sympathetically and reaches for a poultice made from mashed onion and mouldy bread and sheep tallow. She slaps it on without ceremony. No gloves, no sterilisation, just experience and a strong stomach. Here's your fringe medical fact of the night. Mouldy bread was actually a halfway decent treatment for infection. It contained penicillin-adjacent compounds that could slow bacterial growth. So that fetid little lump may have smelled like the bottom of a boot, but it occasionally worked. Emphasis on occasionally. After wrapping the leg, the apothecary sprinkles dried mint over the wound, not for healing, but to help with the smell. Then she hands the patient a drink. A thick concoction of wine, wormwood, and powdered cloves. A medieval painkiller. He gulps it and instantly gags. You don't blame him. You'd rather chew a shoe. This is where historians love to fight. Some argue that medieval medicine was backwards, grotesque, and wildly unscientific. Others insist it was misunderstood, more advanced than it gets credit for, especially in its use of natural remedies and its early grasp of preventative care. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The theories may have been off, humour imbalance, miasma, cursed breezes, but the trial and error methods, occasionally they hit gold, or at least silver. You glance at the shelves again and spot a jar labelled treacle, not the syrup you're thinking of. Medieval treacle was a complex mixture of herbs, spices, minerals, and sometimes bits of viper. It was believed to cure poison, plague, and stomach upset. In reality, it mostly cured your appetite. The apothecary offers you a sniff from a small jar of theriac, an ancient remedy made with dozens of ingredients and aged like wine. You politely lean in. One whiff and your eyes water. You follow at a distance as he approaches a house marked with a red X. A woman meets him at the door, clutching a bundle to her chest. Maybe a child, maybe blankets. She says something you can't hear, her voice small and cracked. The doctor listens, tilting his head slightly, then steps inside. The door closes. Silence returns. These doctors weren't always real doctors. Many were barely trained. Barber surgeons, failed apothecaries, or anyone desperate or broke, enough to take the job. Cities hired them when outbreaks got bad, mostly to keep records, estimate death tolls and supervise quarantines. They couldn't stop the plague, but they could look official while doing almost nothing. And people still trusted them, because someone had to show up. Someone had to carry the smell of action, even if it was more ritual than remedy. The mask, while absurd looking, was based on a flawed but logical theory. If bad air caused disease, then filtering that air through fragrant herbs might offer protection. Some even believed strong smells could repel disease, as if plague had taste and couldn't stand rosemary. The robes were made of waxed cloth or leather to block the air. The gloves, boots and cane added distance. They weren't touching your sores or breathing your breath. They were ghosts in armour. And yet, despite all this gear, plague doctors still died, in droves. The miasma theory didn't account for fleas, rats or bacteria, but it lingered because it gave people something to do. Light incense, stuff flowers in your mask, burn bundles of thyme in your fireplace. It was protection through participation. Smell became a shield, even if it was paper thin. The doctor exits the house. He walks slowly, muttering something as he goes. A prayer, a list, a report. He lifts his cane and taps the doorframe. Tap, tap, tap. The message is clear. Stay inside, don't breathe too deep. Here's your bizarre fringe fact of the night. Some plague doctors recommended carrying a dead toad in a pouch around your neck. Allegedly, it would draw out the poison from your blood. Others swore by crushed emeralds, burned feathers, or roasted onions stuffed with herbs. One particularly unhelpful recipe called for a paste made from chopped snakes, which sounds like an insult to snakes and patients. Still, the mask stuck. Over time it became a symbol, not just of the plague, but of medicine itself. An early hazmat suit, a desperate invention, something between science and superstition. Today you'd laugh at it. But back then, it was the only thing standing between the sick and the dead. And even that wasn't guaranteed. You keep walking, and now the smell of the herbs lingers in your nostrils, faint but persistent. You can pick out lavender, maybe camphor, something sharp like vinegar. The odour of fear, carefully curated. This wasn't perfume, it was armour. There's a scholarly debate about the actual effectiveness of these masks. Some researchers believe they might have offered limited protection, blocking larger droplets, deterring flies. Others say they were functionally useless but psychologically crucial. After all, if you saw someone in that outfit coming toward you, you knew something serious was happening, and in a time when medicine was more performance than precision, appearances mattered. You pass another house now. This one isn't marked, but you hear coughing from within, wet, ragged, a child crying, a soft hymn being sung by a voice already fraying at the edges. You wonder if the doctor will return here tomorrow, if another door will be marked, if the stench will deepen. The air grows heavier with the smell of burning herbs. Someone nearby is fumigating their home. A brazier smokes on a windowsill, sending up a steady plume of white vapour. It doesn't smell bad, just bitter, smoky, medicinal. But it mixes with the city's usual flavours and becomes something more complicated. Something ancient. A smell you'll remember. It's not the plague itself that stinks. It's the reaction to it. The desperate measures. The thick masks. The rotting bodies left too long in sunlit rooms. The incense burned in hope. The vinegar baths and garlic-soaked cloths. And under it all, the quiet, awful truth that none of it worked. The plague doctor is gone now. Vanished into the alleys like a shadow evaporating in moonlight. But his scent remains, an echo of survival, stitched together with herbs and resignation. You take a deep breath, and for once, you don't cough. You just smell the past, heavy, fragrant, and full of ghosts. The night deepens, and the city begins to quiet. Even the smell seems to settle into itself, like a quilt draped over the streets, woven from soot, sweat, and smoke. But just when you think you've reached peak sensory saturation, a new scent creeps into your nose, acrid, sharp, metallic. You follow it without meaning to, drawn by instinct until you realise where you are, the edge of the tanner's quarter, and suddenly everything you've smelled so far feels like the prelude to the main act. Because tanning hides in medieval times, that was next level foul. The first thing to hit you is the ammonia, not store-bought nice and sterile ammonia. No, this is biological, raw, the kind that comes from urine, which was the foundational ingredient in preparing leather. Not just human urine either, though that was the most common. People would donate it. There were literal street-side jars where you could relieve yourself and help fuel the tanning economy. You could practically pee for profit. You step into a narrow lane where wooden sheds lean at odd angles over vats of what looks like soup, but is definitely not. The liquid bubbles sluggishly. A man with thick arms and a nose like an old potato stirs it with a paddle, whistling. His apron is stained every imaginable shade of brown, and his boots squelch when he walks. The air here is so thick with odour you can taste it. Not metaphorically, literally. The sting of it curls your tongue and makes your teeth feel fuzzy. Hides hang from racks overhead. Goat, sheep, cow, all in various stages of processing. Some still have bits of flesh clinging to them. Others drip steadily into troughs below. This is the process. First the hides are soaked in urine to loosen the hair. Then they're scraped clean with curved knives, thrown into a pit of lime to remove any remaining tissue, and finally soaked in a stew of dung and enzymes to soften them. That's right, dung. Often dog dung, sometimes pigeon. You don't ask where they get it. The tanner you're watching now lifts a hide from the vat, wrings it out like a wet towel and flings it onto a scraping bench. A shower of droplets splashes your boots. He nods at you like it's nothing. You nod back like you didn't just lose your last shred of olfactory dignity. Here's your delightful fringe fact. In some towns, tanners were legally required to live and work outside the main city walls because the stench was considered unbearable. Entire neighbourhoods became associated with the trade. If someone told you they were from Tanner's Row, you knew exactly what they smelled like. Forever. But this wasn't just unpleasant. It was necessary. Leather was used for everything. Shoes, belts, armour, saddles, book bindings, water skins, tool sheaths. Without tanners, the medieval world would be barefoot, bookless and badly bruised. And the work, as repellent as it was, required real skill. Timing the soak, judging the texture, knowing when to scrape and when to cure. This wasn't mindless labour. It was craftsmanship. Stinky, revolting craftsmanship. You walk further down the lane, past rows of vats, where younger apprentices are elbow deep in brown sludge. One of them scratches his head with a dung-covered glove. Another hums a tune as he kicks a sack of lime across the yard. You'd expect these people to be miserable, but they're not. They've adapted. Their noses have surrendered. Or maybe they've built a kind of nasal immunity the rest of us can only dream of. And here's the kicker. These men go home at night. They return to their families smelling like a haunted privy. Some try to rinse off in the river. Some don't bother. There's a reason people associated certain professions with a permanent aura of stink. A tanner could walk into a church and people would subtly shift a few pews over. And yet they made good money. As with the gong farmers, society needed them, but preferred not to sit too close. There's ongoing debate among historians about just how unbearable these industrial smells were. Some argue that because everyone lived with strong smells, fires, animals, chamber pots, people didn't find tanning as overwhelming as we would. Others insist that even by medieval standards, tanneries were hellish. The fact that cities kept them at arm's length suggests that the nose knows. You peek into a workshop at the end of the lane. Leather goods hang from hooks and walls. Saddles, belts, pouches, even gloves that you now know came from a process involving multiple layers of rot. The air inside is drier, but still sharp. The finished leather smells better than its origins, but there's a ghost of its past still clinging to the edges. A kind of musky truth. A craftsman works at the table, carving a design into a new sheath. He sees you, shrugs, and says, "The smell keeps the thieves away." You smile, unsure whether he's joking. Probably not. Outside, the wind finally shifts, carrying a different scent in from the river. Fresher, more open, but laced with the ever-present tang of smoke and damp. You take a breath, relieved to be away from the vats, but strangely the smell stays with you. It's in your hair, your hands, your brainstem probably. You look back one last time. A group of workers heave a massive rawhide into a vat, their boots slapping through the muck. Steam rises, a few birds circle overhead, but even they seem hesitant to land, and it hits you. This was the price of comfort. Shoes, bags, saddles, armour, books. Every item came with a history, a stinking, fleshy, urine-soaked history. And someone had to live with that smell so that someone else could live with the product. So you walk on, a little humbled, a lot nauseated, and filled with a fresh respect for anyone who could make a career out of fermented filth and still whistle through it. Because now you know, tanning wasn't just about leather. It was about endurance, about walking through the worst the world could offer and turning it into something someone else could wear proudly. Smell optional. Morning again, and the city is already heaving with sound and stink. You're bleary-eyed, nose half numb, wondering how you've made it this far without passing out or giving up. And yet, here you are, ready for another stroll through medieval olfactory horror. Today's delight, water, or rather, the complete lack of clean water. Because in the Middle Ages, water wasn't your friend. It was more like that sketchy neighbour who occasionally helps you, but mostly tries to kill you. You begin your journey along the banks of a winding river, glistening under a hazy sun. From a distance it looks lovely, peaceful even. But the closer you get, the more you realise it's less of a river and more of a communal waste highway. There's a man dumping slop from a wooden bucket, a butcher rinsing blood from his tools, a woman beating laundry with a paddle right next to where someone just let their dog relieve itself. You think about what's in that water. Animal guts, feces, all species, urine, dead fish, rotting food, and the occasional unlucky rat. Now imagine drinking it, and yet people did. Not everyone, of course. The wealthy had their own wells, sometimes lined in stone, guarded like treasure. Monasteries built aqueducts or had access to cleaner sources, and noble households employed water carriers to haul it in from upstream. But for your average townsfolk, the river was it. Bath water, laundry water, drinking water, and latrine all rolled into one endlessly looping horror cycle. You pass a group of children filling pails. They splash each other, laugh, maybe even sneak a drink. You watch a woman carefully ladle water through a linen cloth to strain out the larger debris. Doesn't help much. It's still cloudy, still smells vaguely of onions and fish. But when there are no options, you make do. Here's a pungent little historical twist. Many people avoided water altogether, not because they understood bacteria, but because they knew that drinking it often led to illness. So what did they drink instead? beer. Weak, low alcohol, small beer, brewed daily in households and monasteries alike. It was safer than water because the brewing process involved boiling. Even children drank it. A toddler sipping warm barley beer from a wooden cup. Totally normal. You turn into a narrow alley where a brewmaster is stirring a cauldron, steam rising into the air. The smell is better here. Yeasty, earthy, sour, sweet. Not good, but at least not aggressive. He waves you over and offers a sample from a clay mug. It's lukewarm, flat, and slightly gritty. But it doesn't taste like disease, which in this town makes it premium. Now walk with me back toward a public fountain. These were prized when they existed, usually supplied by lead pipes or wooden conduits from springs miles away. The water was cleaner and people lined up to fill their jugs, but the infrastructure was fragile, pipes broke, supply was inconsistent, and of course people still used the area around the fountain as a hangout spot, which meant litter, waste and the occasional casual public urination. So yes, the water started clean, but it didn't stay that way. And then there's the bathhouse. You approach a low stone building with smoke curling from the chimney and laughter echoing inside. Communal bathing was a thing, especially in cities with Roman influence where the ruins of aqueducts and bathhouses still stood. But let's not get romantic. These weren't exactly spas. The bathwater was shared. It was rarely changed. And while you might walk in to scrub your body, you'd also be bathing alongside old bandages, questionable fungi, and someone's pet ferret. Not a metaphor. People actually brought ferrets to baths. The interior is humid, the air wet and smelling of boiled feet and rosemary. There's a mix of sweat, soap, mildew, and something that might be broth. You watch two men argue over who's been soaking too long. A woman oils her hair with a mixture of goose fat and lavender. A boy jumps in and immediately starts coughing. The water ripples with floating debris, and through it all people are relaxed, content even. Because this is one of the rare times you're warm, submerged, and sort of clean. You just try not to inhale too deeply. Eventually public bathhouses fell out of favour, especially after outbreaks of plague or when the church began to associate communal nudity with moral decay. Cleanliness wasn't just inconvenient, it was suspicious. If you spent too much time washing, you were either vain or sinful. Better to stay dirty and humble. You exit the bathhouse into the cool morning air, dripping and maybe even slightly fresher than before. But the feeling doesn't last. You're immediately hit by the smell of the street again. Vendor dumps a bucket of grey water into the gutter, and it sloshes past your boots carrying bits of vegetable, soap scum, and something vaguely organic. And this is the thing. Water moved. Unlike chamber pots or garbage, water flowed, which meant everything bad in it moved too. Downhill, into other homes, into cellars, into the city's drinking wells if things got really bad. Floods were nightmares. Heavy rains could flood latrines and wash waste into homes. In some places, laws were passed banning tanners and butchers from working near rivers, but enforcement was laughable. People did what they had to do, and rivers, already burdened with centuries of use, slowly turned from lifelines to liquid landfills. Let's pause for a fringe detail. In some towns, it was common to place warning signs, or literal barrels filled with sweet herbs, near contaminated wells to signal danger. Others attempted to purify water by adding wine, vinegar, or boiling it with mint. Creative, but rarely effective. The debate today among historians revolves around just how bad it was. Some argue that medieval people were aware of contamination and did their best to avoid it, citing precautions and folk wisdom. Others point to the relentless waves of waterborne disease, dysentery, cholera, typhoid, and say whatever they tried, it clearly wasn't enough. Probably both are true. People knew something was wrong, they just didn't know what, and even if they did, they often couldn't afford to act differently. Now you stand at the edge of the river again. It bubbles along as though nothing's wrong, shining in the sun, masking its sins under reflections of clouds and birds. A woman kneels by the bank rinsing a bundle of clothes. A boy splashes nearby, chasing a dog through the shallows. The air is still, and for a moment it smells almost normal, almost fresh. But you know better. You've walked the city. You've felt the water seep into your boots. You've tasted the layers of centuries-old grime that ride every current. and you understand now why so many feared water, avoided it, replaced it with beer, or boiled it until it screamed. In the medieval world, water wasn't your friend. It was an acquaintance who often tried to kill you. By now, you've braved the tanner's pit, sipped questionable bath water, and inhaled more varieties of fermented air than you ever wanted to name, so it feels only fair to head somewhere quieter, somewhere reverent, sacred even. You walk slowly now, boots squelching in yesterday's mud, toward the tall spires of the cathedral, because tonight you're exploring the grand halls of medieval religion, not for theology, but for aroma. And surprise, even the holiest places weren't exempt from the grand medieval stinkfest. The cathedral looms ahead like a stone ship sailing over a sea of wooden rooftops. Towering, impressive, divine, and, if you're being honest, slightly mossy. You enter through the heavy oak doors, and the first thing to hit you isn't incense or candle wax. It's a damp, earthy chill like cold breath from a crypt. The walls weep moisture. The stone smells of mildew and ancient dust. It's not offensive, but it's present, like a quiet warning. Here be centuries. You walk slowly up the central aisle. Light filters through stained glass, casting reds and blues onto the worn flagstones. The air thickens as you move closer to the altar. Now comes the incense, the unmistakable blend of frankincense, myrrh, and whatever mystery resin the sacristan mixed in that morning. It's smoky, sweet, cloying. It hangs low in the air, coiling around the columns and drifting like a ghost above the pews. And here's the thing. The incense wasn't just for ceremony, it was a full-on tactical manoeuvre. When your congregation is packed shoulder to shoulder with unwashed bodies, flea-bitten pilgrims, and the occasional farm animal tied up in the back, something has to keep the air at least partially breathable. Incense wasn't holy air, it was medieval Febreze. You take a seat in one of the wooden pews which creak under your weight and smell faintly of wax, dust, and centuries of shared behinds. Around you, worshippers murmur prayers, shifting in wool cloaks and linen hoods. Some carry posies of herbs or scented cloths tied around their wrists, not just for reverence, but to block out their neighbours' less than divine emissions. And this is where it gets tricky. Religion in the Middle Ages was deeply intertwined with smell. Sweet scents were associated with holiness. The odour of sanctity was a literal belief that saints' bodies, when exhumed, might smell of roses or spices instead of rot. Miraculous? Perhaps. Or maybe someone got creative with clove oil during embalming. Either way, scent was a spiritual signal. You wander toward the side chapels where candle smoke mixes with human breath and the lingering reek of waxy tallow. Unlike modern clean-burning candles, medieval versions were often made from animal fat, especially in poorer parishes. Tallow candles didn't burn sweetly. They sputtered, smoked, and smelled like someone grilled a sheep indoors. Add that to the body heat of a packed mass, and you've got yourself a holy stew. You peer into the confessional, where the scent is intimate. Sweat, breath, maybe the faint spice of regret. The priest sits behind the screen, whispering absolutions, his robe absorbing decades of sin and incense. No one talks about it, but confessionals had their own atmosphere. Small, close, unforgiving. Now let's talk relics, because nothing brings out the medieval nose quite like a reliquary. You approach an ornate golden box on a pedestal, set with gems, polished by centuries of reverent hands. Inside, a bone fragment from a saint's finger, or maybe a lock of hair, or a vial of dried blood sealed with wax and hope. The box itself smells of old metal, incense residue, and faint mildew. You resist the urge to sniff directly. Here's your strange historical tidbit. Some churches went overboard. Not just one relic, but dozens. Rooms full of saintly fragments. And when those weren't enough, they'd sprinkle the space with holy oils, burn extra incense, or, even worse, display entire bodies. Mummified. Saints, encased corpses. And yes, even if the smell of sanctity was a thing, decomposition doesn't always get the memo. You head down into the crypt now. It's cooler here, damper. The smell of earth is stronger. Wet stone, old bones, something that might be mould or might be memory. Tombs line the walls, some carved, some sealed, some still marked with faint Latin inscriptions. Down here you're closer to the truth of mortality, and it smells like it. Stillness, age, a soft rot that no incense can completely hide. Back upstairs, the choir has begun to sing. Their voices echo through the nave, and for a moment the sound seems to lift the air. Maybe it's the acoustics, or maybe it's the human instinct to find beauty in the middle of discomfort. The smell hasn't changed. Still incense, still wool, still sweat. But somehow it feels less suffocating, more balanced, like the music evens out the funk. This is where the scholars love to argue. Some say churches were sanctuaries of cleanliness and light, carefully kept, lovingly maintained. Others say they were dense with grime and odour, only masked by ritual and perfume. The truth, again, is somewhere in the middle. Cathedrals were awe-inspiring. They were also draughty, dim, and filled with people who hadn't bathed in a month. You walk past a monk carrying a thurible, the metal censer swinging from a chain, spitting sparks and smoke. He's doused it with fresh incense and the scent rushes toward you again, spicy, rich, and utterly overwhelming. You breathe it in, cough once, and try not to look like a tourist. Let's not forget the side business of the church, healing. Monasteries often ran infirmaries, and those came with their own nose punch. Medicinal herbs, bleeding bowls, poultices, sick beds, all tucked somewhere behind the cloister. The monks tried their best, but a sick ward in the 13th century was not where you wanted to be if you valued your sense of smell, or your will to live. As you leave the cathedral, the sun is just beginning to rise again. The city is stirring. A dog barks, a chamber pot is dumped, and as the holy smells of incense fade behind you, they mix once more with the world outside, the gritty, honest stink of a medieval morning. And yet something's shifted. You're still surrounded by odour, still wearing it like a second skin, but the scent of the cathedral clings just enough to remind you that even in the filth, people reached for beauty, for meaning, for air that smelled like something more than survival. As the cathedral's incense trails behind you, and your boots find their way back to the muck-slicked cobbles, something curious begins to happen. Your mind, exhausted by sensory overload, starts craving not relief, but understanding. You've sniffed your way through slaughterhouses, bathhouses and basilicas, but now it's time to turn to the part of history that tries, nobly and occasionally hilariously, to put all of this into words. That's right. Tonight, you're diving into art and literature, the medieval attempts to describe the indescribable. What did people write about the stench? Did they paint it? Sing it? Whisper it like a ghost story around their crusty hearths? The short answer? Oh yes, they absolutely did. You begin in the library of a local monastery, and when I say library, don't imagine anything too grand. This isn't some marble-floored hall of learning. It's a cold stone room with shelves made of splintering oak, creaking under the weight of parchment scrolls and hand-copied codices. The smell here is oddly comforting, a mix of ink, mildew, candle wax, and the leather covers of countless books, many of which, yes, were tanned using methods you've already suffered through. A monk in a frayed robe guides you toward a text from the 14th century. You squint at the cramped Latin, eyes watering in the candlelight, and even with your rudimentary grasp of the language, you catch the tone. Descriptions of plague cities dripping with decay, markets buzzing with the reek of open butchery, and accounts of nobles passing peasants and physically gagging. One phrase stands out. The air was so full of corruption that it seemed to bleed. Subtle? No. Effective? Very. You flip through other manuscripts, medical treatises, moral poems, travelogues, and over again, there it is. Stench, given personality, almost treated like a character in its own right. Sometimes it's a punishment, a sign of divine disfavour. Other times it's a warning, a low-budget miasma version of foreshadowing. When someone enters a scene and they're hit by a foul wind, you know it's about to go sideways. Here's your quirky historical gem. There were entire lists of smells ranked by virtue and sin. Sweet-smelling herbs were holy. Frankincense and rosewater were divine. But sulphur, rot, and, you guessed it, human waste were signs of corruption, both moral and physical. Some monks even kept scented wax tablets in their robes so they could press them to their noses during moments of social crisis. You admire the commitment. But smell wasn't just scribbled in the margins of theology. It was in art too. You move now through a chapel gallery where frescoes climb the damp walls. The scenes are biblical, of course, but sometimes you spot strange details. A figure holding their nose, a cloud of greenish smoke hovering over a battlefield, a saint serenely breathing through a posy as they walk through what is clearly a dung-ridden street. The artist couldn't paint smell, so they hinted at it, through colour, posture, even squiggly lines that look suspiciously like cartoon stink trails. One particularly famous medieval manuscript, the De Quinum Sanitatis, a health and lifestyle guide, features miniatures of daily life. You look closely at one image of a bustling market. At first glance, it's lively and colourful. But then you see a man emptying a bucket into the street next to a produce stand, a butcher's stall dripping red into the gutter, a dog sniffing what can only be. The streets are emptier now. The sun is dipping again, casting long shadows between timbered houses and flickering off the puddles left by someone's late afternoon bucket dump. A thin fog is settling low, carrying with it a blanket of blended city aromas, old ash, damp straw, something charred and vaguely edible. You're bone-tired, nose-numb, and yet oddly alert. Because tonight you're going to meet a nose that changed the course of human history. Not a scholar, not a saint, just a man who, after sniffing one too many days of city sewer stew, decided he'd had enough. Welcome to the part of history where disgust finally gives way to innovation. You're in 19th century London now, not medieval anymore, but walking in the long shadow of centuries of stench. See, for all the wild smells of the Middle Ages, the stinking habits didn't just disappear with a few Enlightenment lectures and powdered wigs. They lingered, and it all came to a head in what historians lovingly refer to as the Great Stink. Sounds like a Monty Python sketch. Wasn't. Let's set the scene. It's the summer of 1858. The Thames, which runs like a vein through the city, is nothing more than a warm, slow-moving sewer. People have been dumping into it for centuries. Latrine waste, butcher remains, dead pets, the occasional full-grown pig. Had an unusually hot summer, no rainfall, and thousands of chamber pots being emptied into underground cesspits already overflowing. And boom! The whole city starts to smell like Satan's diaper. Now, this wasn't news to anyone. London had always stunk. What was new was how high the stink climbed. Parliament sat right on the edge of the Thames, and that year the odour seeped through the open windows and practically choked the MPs where they sat. Imagine trying to write laws while gagging. They hung soaked curtains over the windows, burned extra incense and tried to carry on, but there was no escaping it. The stink had arrived. Enter Joseph Basil Gett, the nose that changed history. Okay, technically he was a civil engineer. But let's be real, without his sense of smell and his patience finally snapping, the city might have taken another century to clean itself up. Basil Gett had been campaigning for modern sewers for years, but nobody listened. Until the day Parliament collectively dry-heaved itself into action. Nothing motivates politicians like immediate personal disgust. Basil Gett designed a massive underground sewer network, hundreds of miles of tunnels beneath London directing waste away from the river and out to sea. It was ambitious, brilliant and expensive, but it worked. And once it did, people noticed something else. Disease, cholera, dysentery, typhoid, dropped. Dramatically. Turns out cleaning up the stink also cleaned up the germs. And that's the moment. The pivot point. For centuries, smell was just part of life. You covered it, tolerated it, joked about it. But now it triggered change. Real, measurable societal transformation. The nose had had enough. You consider taking a bath? That's adorable. Public bathhouses are frowned upon these days. Too sinful, too suspect. Besides, they're rarely clean. The water's been used 12 times already, and there's a guy named Cedric who never leaves and might have leprosy. So you skip the bath and head to dinner. You're invited to a local feast. Nothing fancy, just a good old-fashioned communal meal with 30 of your closest unwashed neighbours. The food smells good from a distance. Up close, not so much. But everyone's too hungry to complain. You eat roast meat drenched in sauce to mask the smell of decay. Drink wine cut with vinegar, and finish with something they call pudding, but which clearly contains chunks of something that once had a face. As people eat, they burp. Loudly. One guy leans under the table and relieves himself with a sound like the bellows of a dying ox. Another quietly vomits into a wooden bowl and keeps chewing. It's not rudeness, it's commitment. By nightfall, the smells have layered on you like emotional trauma. You try to sleep, but the tanner's quarter upwind has had a particularly aromatic day, and the breeze is not your friend. Somewhere nearby, someone's burning wet dung. Someone else is probably dying of dysentery. You pull your blanket over your nose. It doesn't help. And that's just one day. So, back to our question. Would you survive the smell? Physically? Sure, maybe. You'd gag. You'd cry. You'd invent new curse words. But your body would adjust, eventually. Your brain would dull the edges. Your nose would build its walls. You might even get nostalgic for it in a horrifying Stockholm Syndrome kind of way. But mentally, that's where it gets dicey. Modern noses are pampered. We've grown up in worlds sanitised, perfumed, filtered and labelled fragrance-free. Our air is regulated, our water's treated, our garbage is carted away in the dead of night like a secret shame. We've forgotten what humans can tolerate, what they did tolerate, what they lived in, laughed in, worked in, and yes, loved in. Because make no mistake, people didn't just endure medieval stench, they thrived in spite of it. They got married, had children, composed poems, built cathedrals, sang songs, invented absurdly complicated armour, and somehow kept showing up to work even if their job involved swimming in a pit of decomposing cow skin. That's the magic of it, isn't it? They lived fully, stink and all. So, would you survive it? Maybe. If you had a strong stomach, a weaker sense of smell and the good fortune not to fall into a moat. But would you enjoy it? Unlikely. You'd miss hot showers. You'd miss citrus-scented floor cleaner. You'd miss breezes that didn't carry particles. But after walking this path, after smelling what they smelled, seeing what they saw, maybe, just maybe, you'd come back to your world with a little more gratitude. For soap, for sewage systems, for windows that open, for trash that disappears, and most of all for air that doesn't bite. So take a deep breath, my friend. The journey's over, the stink still lingers, but you've made it. You walked through history's worst-smelling century and lived to tell the tale. You've made it. The long, winding trail of scents, from the fetid streets of medieval cities to the sacred incense-draped halls of ancient cathedrals, has finally brought you back to the present. It's a relief to be breathing air free from the overwhelming funk of centuries past. And yet, as you settle in, you realise that the medieval stench was more than just an assault on the senses. It was a vivid, living part of history itself. That stench tells a story of survival and adaptation. It speaks of people who coped with filth, not just because they had to, but because they had no choice. They found meaning in the smell of burning herbs, comfort in the shared space of crowded homes, and even holiness in the musk of unwashed flesh. Through all the grime and grit, life went on, messy, loud, stubborn life. You think of the gong farmers, who braved unimaginable odours to keep cities from drowning in their own waste. The tanners, whose work was essential though their noses paid the price. The plague doctors wearing beaked masks stuffed with herbs, battling invisible enemies armed with little more than hope and superstition. You remember the marketplaces where food and filth mingled inseparably, and the bathhouses that were both places of cleansing and temptation. Most of all, you reflect on the transformations sparked by the great stink of the 19th century. How public outrage over unbearable smells pushed societies towards sanitation and public health innovations. The legacy of Joseph Bazalgette's sewer system reminds us that change often comes when the discomfort becomes impossible to ignore, when smell forces action. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps with a nose still twitching at the memory of centuries-old stench, you carry with you a new appreciation for clean water, for soap, for the miracle of breathable air, for the unglamorous heroes who dealt with the worst so others could live better. And maybe, just maybe, you'll dream tonight not of lavender fields or rose gardens, but of something more profound. The resilience of humanity, rising above the stink, a dead rat. The artist didn't describe the smell in words. He didn't need to. It's there, hiding in plain sight. You shift to poetry next. Yes, there was a whole genre of medieval poetry obsessed with bodily functions and odour. Chaucer, that rascal, gave us characters whose breath could stink worse than a slaughterhouse. In The Miller's Tale, a man literally farts in another man's face through a window. Romance? Maybe not. Memorable? Absolutely. And then there are the moralists, always ready to weaponize stench for spiritual messaging. They wrote sermons comparing sin to rot, hell to a place where the air never cleared, and vanity to the sour scent of expensive perfume over old sweat. You chuckle reading one such passage that accuses painted ladies of covering their filth with scented powders until they reeked like perfumed pigs. That monk had opinions. Scholars debate whether these descriptions were exaggerated. Surely people couldn't have been that smelly, they argue. But the consistency of the records, the endless repetition of stink, stink and more stink tells its own story. Even if noses were more tolerant, the idea of odour as a metaphor, a tool and a cultural marker was deeply embedded. You stumble across a travelling merchant's journal next. His descriptions are blunt, vivid, and occasionally hilarious. One entry reads, "In Avignon the street smelled of meat too long in the sun and cheese too long in the mouth." Poetic? Maybe not. Honest? Painfully. But not all descriptions were negative. Some accounts romanticise smell. Lavender fields in Provence, rosemary burned in winter homes, the delicate scent of beeswax candles during a marriage blessing. These were rare, precious moments. Smell could be sacred. Smell could be home. It wasn't all bad. It was just everywhere. As you roll up a scroll and prepare to leave, the monk offers you a final volume. It's a devotional, edges stained with time, filled with prayers and reflections. One passage catches your eye. It asks God to make the soul sweet as incense, even if the flesh remains earthy. And that perhaps was the whole point. Medieval people lived in a world of unavoidable stench, but they dreamed of sweetness, spiritually, if not literally. You step outside into the wind, the city's usual cocktail waiting for you. Smoke, livestock, sweat, and now, newly layered in your mind, the whispered scent of ink, parchment, and earnest attempts to describe the indescribable. The Middle Ages stank, yes, but they also noticed, they recorded, they remembered, and if nothing else they tried, through words, pictures and prayers, to make sense of it. And now, as a breeze stirs your hair, and the sharp edge of a nearby fishmonger's stall hits your nose, you can't help but smile, because you've seen the art that almost smells. But before you give all the credit to Victorian noses, let's be clear, this was a chain reaction, centuries in the making. You don't get to the great stink without first trudging through the Middle Ages, without the chamber pots, the tanneries, the butchered pigs in alleyways, without centuries of people writing "this place reeks" into the margins of their poems. The stench built slowly, and then all at once. There's a scholarly debate here naturally. Some argue that Bazalgette's success had more to do with luck and timing than public disgust. Others say the moral panic over smell, the fear that bad air corrupted not just the body but the soul, was the true motivator. Still others point to the miasma theory's final gasp. After all, Bazalgette's system was built on the assumption that smell spread disease. That part was wrong, but the solution, remove the stink and you'll save lives, turned out to be perfectly, gloriously right. You stand now on the embankment above one of Bazalgette's great pumping stations. The air smells, not great, but better, like wet brick and old iron. You peer down and the tunnel stretches away into darkness. The engineering is astonishing. The man literally gave the city new arteries, and the result was health, longevity, and the first modern step toward not living in your own filth. And the thing is, once one city did it, others followed. Paris, Berlin, New York. The 19th century became the century of clean, not because people suddenly became virtuous, but because they were disgusted. By the noise, by the waste, but most of all, by the smell. It wasn't a priest or a poet that finally pushed the world to change, it was a man with a cloth to his nose and a mission in his gut. Here's a fantastic fringe tidbit. Bazalgette, when designing his sewer system, deliberately built the pipes twice as large as anyone thought necessary. For future generations, he said. He was right. London still uses parts of his system today, and had he not over-engineered them, it would have collapsed long ago. So not only did his nose save the day, it saved our day too. You head back into the medieval city in your mind, walking the same narrow streets, but now you see them differently. Every pile of filth, every blocked gutter, every unfortunate splash of chamber pot juice down a back wall, it all led somewhere. It all meant something. And eventually someone had the courage to say, "Enough. My nose deserves better." You pause by the riverbank one more time, watching the water flow dark and sluggish under the moonlight. And you imagine the moment when it first ran clear again, when people looked out and saw not a ditch of death, but something close to beautiful, and when they took a deep breath, hesitated, and smiled. Not because it smelled good, but because it didn't smell like anything at all. So here we are, the final stretch. You followed your nose, willingly or otherwise, through the darkest alleys, the foulest vats, and the warmest communal bathwater the medieval world had to offer. You've sniffed rotting fish, lived through the plague in a perfume-soaked beak, and stood toe-to-toe with a tanner who used pigeon droppings as skincare. And now there's only one question left to ask, the big one, the stinker to end all stinkers. Would you survive the smell? Let's be honest, you've come a long way. You've built up a tolerance. At this point, your 21st century nose is probably numb, but imagine just for a moment dropping into the 14th century for real. No preparation, no gradual adjustment, no lavender-infused face mask. Just bam! Straight into a world where deodorant hasn't been invented, the streets are paved in everything but cobblestone, and the closest thing to indoor plumbing is a wooden seat over a fly-ridden pit. Let's take a walk through the full medieval sensory package, your final exam, if you will. First stop, your bedroom. It's early morning, you're waking up under a heavy wool blanket that smells of wet dog and smoke. Your bedmate, likely a family member or possibly three, rolls over, breathing directly into your face with last night's mutton breath. There's a chamber pot under the bed. It's full. The rushes on the floor are crunchy. You don't want to know why. Next, you head outside to start the day. The street greets you like a punch to the lungs. The usual, horse dung, human waste, rotting vegetables, and the lingering sour tang of yesterday's fishmonger stall. A goose honks angrily near your feet. Someone nearby is dumping the morning's slop out a window. You don't duck in time. Hungry? Of course you are. So you stop by a vendor's cart where something vaguely pie-shaped sizzles on a griddle. It smells okay, until you realise the meat might be cat, or rat, or pigeon that died of natural causes. The pastry's been reheated 7 times and still has a bit of hay in it. You take a bite anyway. It's surprisingly chewy. Now it's time to work. Maybe you're a blacksmith, a brewer, a fishwife, a dung collector. Doesn't matter. No matter the trade, your day will involve intense smells. Smoke, yeast, rust, salt, vomit, beer, soap, blood, mould. If you're lucky, you get a minute of fresh air behind the stables. If you're really lucky, the wind's blowing away from the latrine pits today. By midday, your clothes are soaked with sweat and whatever fluids your job happened to involve. You haven't changed them in a week. Your hair is crunchy, your teeth are furry, your feet are in a long-term relationship with fungus. Someone sneezes nearby. You offer them a small posy of herbs, because let's be real, that's your entire health insurance policy. You catch a whiff of their breath. It's medieval halitosis, a charming blend of onions, mead and decaying molars.